You. I pointed at a random trooper. Get a broom, I barked. Every pair of eyes in the room suddenly swung in my direction. I thought I could see my reflection in every pupil, tracking me like auspex. The troopers had barely seemed human. Emperor dammit, I'd seen cornate cultists with more self-restraint than those supposedly disciplined guard troopers displayed in the mess hall. The room hung in suspended, confused anticipation, the silence stretching for an infinite second. No one moved. That was not a request, I said, raising my voice a little, and taking another step forward. This mess hall is an absolute disgrace, and no one's leaving until it's been tidied up. My urge to evacuate the room upon entering had been foiled by the attention of my commissariat uniform, for which I had found to be an equally effective tool as a commanding tone. One of the first things you learn as a commissar is that people are never pleased to see you. Something that's no longer the case where I am concerned, of course, now that my glorious and undeserved reputation precedes me wherever I go. A good rule of thumb in my younger days, but I'd never found myself staring down death in the eyes of troopers I was supposed to be inspiring with loyalty to the Emperor before. In my early years as an occasional loyal minion of His Glorious Majesty, I'd faced, or to be more accurate, ran away from screaming orcs, necrons, tyranids, and a severely hacked-off demon host, just to pick out some of the highlights of my ignominious career. I haven't reached my second century by ignoring these little scuffles of trouble, which sometimes appear out of nowhere, like those itching palms of mine, or the little voice in the back of my head which tells me something seems too good to be true. But in the first few days aboard the Righteous Wrath, I had no such need of subtle promptings from my subconscious. The Valhallan 296th and 301st. My new assignment were formed from the survivors of a recent Tyranid incursion. Though mixed regiments had been heard of, the all-male and all-female regiments had forged a resentment. One I was unfortunate enough to step in the middle of as an entire mess hall of half-beaten and some dead troopers stared bewildered at me. Confusion and uncertainty began to spread, troopers flicking nervous glances at each other, as it gradually began to dawn on them the situation had got well out of hand, and that consequences had to be faced. The guardsmen I pointed out, two of them women, began to edge nervously towards the door. "At the double!" I barked suddenly, with my best parade ground snap. The designated troopers scurried out, ingrained patterns of discipline reasserting themselves, and luckily that was enough. "Bravest thing I ever saw," I heard from behind me, as one of the injured provost was helped away by a couple of his shipmates. He just stood there and faced them down, the whole damn lot. His voice faded away, adding another small increment to my heroic reputation, which I know would be all around the ship by this time tomorrow. Colonel Castine and Major Brocklaw sat opposite me in my quarters. "So what you're trying to tell me," I said, turning a piece of crockery over in my hand, "is that 3 people are dead, 14 still in the infirmary, and a perfectly serviceable mess hall reduced to kindling because your men didn't like the plate they had their meal served on." The respective leaders of each regiment squirmed. Major Brocklaw, a man of perhaps middle age who upon our first meeting had made the mistake of testing my strength. 2 could play at that game, of course, and I had the advantage of a couple of augmetic fingers, so I returned the favour, smiling blandly as the colour drained from his face. Colonel Castine was clearly younger, thrust into her role before expected to. Her enthusiasm had almost completely caught me off guard, making me unsure if she desperately sought approval because of my reputation as the hero of the Imperium. Both had switched to shallow breathing, for the presence of my aide, Gunner Jurgen, who made the unfortunate side effect of producing a miasma of what smelled like rotten socks. Though dim of wit, I had never come across a man who possessed his absolute loyalty. Colonel Castine and Major Brocklaw clearly didn't enjoy each other's company. The trading barbing insults and snide remarks followed down their respective regiments. What I currently possessed was a fighting force that was just as likely to tear itself apart rather than the enemies of the Imperium, which did little good to keep me alive. Dead troopers and rioting over the use of incorrect regiment founding day plates. "This ship is en route to a war zone," I said. "We could be within combat within hours of arrival, and when that happens I have to rely on the trooper next to them, whoever it is. I don't want my people getting killed because they don't trust their own comrades, so they're going to train together, and work together until they start behaving like an Imperial Guard regiment, instead of a bunch of pre-scholar juvies. and then they're going to fight the Emperor's enemies together, and I expect to win. Is that clear? Both nodded. I continued. I've had the ship's astropath contact the Minotaurum, and they've agreed in principle. There is no regiment currently designated Valhallan 597th, so I have proposed adopting that as our new identity. Outcry came from both of them, even a piping up from Castine's aide, Lieutenant Sula, whose face looked to me rather equine. I placed my las pistol upon the table. I've always found that the threat to violence be far more effective than to actually use it. If the new designation is unacceptable, I added, the 48th Penal Legion is also available, I'm told. Sulla blenched. Castine smiled tightly, unsure of how serious I was. The 597th sounds good to me, she said. Major Brocklaw? I asked. An excellent compromise, he said, and he nodded slowly, letting the idea percolate. 8 months. 8 months the regiment had to their new official founding day, and I had 8 months to establish new traditions. Only my next problem had the potential of screwing up all attempts to install order. The fate of the mess hall instigators. I've seen more than my fair share of tribunals over the years, even been in front of them on occasion. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. It's easy to get the result you want out of them. The trick is simply to state your case as clearly and concisely as possible. That, and making damn sure the members of it are on your side to begin with. Captain Parjita, rightly devastated by the death of several of his naval provosts, was clearly out for justice. I had previously served with Valhallans before, with my first assignment to the 12th Field Artillery, my assignment where I had the pleasure of securing my aide Jurgen, and the aura of rotten cheese that oozed from him. Valhalla was an ice world that bred people as stubborn as its perpetual winter, so the line between justice and the prospect of a new commissar executing their friends had the potential to backfire. I stared at the offenders. Kelp was the huge, over-muscled man I'd seen being stabbed, and Trebek, a petite woman who'd almost disemboweled him. They stood at opposite ends of the row of prisoners. In the centre was the young trooper I'd seen stab the provost with a broken plate. His data file told me his name was Thomas Hollenby, and I had to look twice to make sure it was the same man. He was short and skinny, with untidy red hair and a face full of freckles, and he had spent most of the trial looking bewildered and on the verge of tears. I wasn't sure it was him, but I had seen his fit of homicidal rage for myself. Between him and Trebek was another female trooper, one Griselda Valade. She was stocky, brunette, and clearly out of her depth as well. The only one of the group who have killed a fellow trooper. She'd claimed throughout that she'd only intended to fend him off. On Hollenby's other side was Maxim Sorel, a tall, rangy man with short blonde hair and the cold eyes of a killer. Sorel was a sharpshooter, a long las specialist. The others had been carried away by the bloodlust of the mob, but Sorel had slid a knife through the joints of a provost's armour simply because he hadn't seen any reason not to. The last time I looked into eyes like those, they belonged to an Eldar homunculus. When Captain Parjita announced his verdict of guilty on all charges, he turned to me with a self-satisfied smirk. But I had my strategy worked out well in advance. The courtroom, a hastily converted wardroom generally used for the ship's most junior officers, went silent. All the troopers looked terrified, except Sorel. I stood up. A commissar's duty is often harsh, I said. Regulations are there to be obeyed, and discipline to be enforced. And those regulations do indeed prescribe the ultimate penalty for murder, unless there are extenuating circumstances. One of the heaviest burdens a commissar must carry is the responsibility to ensure that the regulations are obeyed not only in the letter, but in the spirit. And it was with that in mind I took the liberty of consulting with them about a possible interpretation of those regulations. A commissar's primary concern must always be the efficiency of the unit to which he is attached, and that means I'm always loath to sacrifice the life of a trained soldier, whatever the circumstances, unless it is the only way to win His Glorious Majesty the victories he requires. It is the judgment of the commissariat that you will be all confined until it becomes expedient to transfer you to a penal legion, where an honourable death on the battlefield would almost certainly befall you in the fullness of time. In the interim, should a particularly hazardous assignment become available, you will all have the honour of volunteering. I saw the deep frown upon Captain Vegeta's face, and the now reassuring nods of my fellow commissars, many of who seemed to be young pups enamoured by my reputation, and one veteran enraptured by my words. The prisoners were trudged out with a look of surprise, all except the cold stare of Sorel. I must say it was a resounding victory. I walked into a room filled with cheers and laughter from the regiment's senior officers. I played up my humility well, as the cheers from my name roared and then died down. I, Castine, Brocklaw and the others raised a toast to the 597th. The 597th, they all shouted, men and women alike, swept along with cheap motions and cheaper rhetoric. In a few short weeks I had formed the regiment into one, but most importantly, I'd established myself as a popular figure amongst the common troopers, which meant they'd watch my back if I was ever careless enough to find myself anywhere near the actual combat zone. Putting them together into an effective fighting force was just a useful bonus, but my mood soured as Castine informed us of our new mission, some backwater dirtball named Gravelax.
Editorial note. What, for want of a better phrase, I will henceforth be referring to as the Cain archive, is, in truth, barely deserving of so grandiloquent a title. It consists merely of a single data slate, stuffed full of files, arranged with a cavalier disregard for chronology. What can be stated with absolute certainty, however, is that the author was none other than the celebrated commissar Ciaphas Cain, and that the archive was written by him during his retirement, while serving as a tutor at the Scholar Progenium. Some of my fellow inquisitors may be shocked to discover that one of the Imperium's most venerated heroes was, by his own admission, a scoundrel and self-seeking rogue, a fact of which, due to our sporadic personal association, I have long been aware. Indeed, I would go so far as to contend that it was this very combination of character flaws which made him one of the most effective servants the Imperium has ever had. In his century or more of active service to the Commissariat, and occasional less visible activities at my behest, he faced and bested almost every enemy of humanity. Necrons, Tau, Tyranids and Orcs, Eldar, both free of taint and corrupted by the ruinous powers, and the demonic agents of those powers themselves. Reluctantly, it must be admitted, but in many cases repeatedly, and always with success, a record few, if any, more noble men can equal. In fairness, it should also be pointed out here that Cain is his own harshest critic, often going out of his way to deny that the many instances in which he appears, despite his professed baser motives, to have acted primarily out of loyalty or altruism, were any such thing. It would be ironic indeed if his awareness of his shortcomings should have blinded him to his own, admittedly often well-hidden, virtues. I have taken the liberty of breaking up the long and unstructured account into relatively self-contained chapters to facilitate reading.
We intended to make an impression with our arrival, and by the Emperor we surely did, setting out to march the 10 kilometers or so into the city. Most of the troopers were glad at the exercise, reveling in the fresh air and sunshine after so long between decks, and swung along the highway, las guns at the slope. Being an old hive boy myself, it was all one to me, but I was affected by the general holiday atmosphere, I think. Mayor, the planetary capital of Gravelax, had earned the title of backwater in my opinion. Located at the edge of current Imperial and Tau space, Gravelax would normally be the center ground for open conflict, though following the current ceasefire between us and the foul Xenos, a sort of cold war was brewing upon this small moon, as evidenced by my growing unease and the mix of architecture. The sharp Gothic of Imperial culture that I was used to became too intermixed with curved and domed buildings. There was insidious alien influence at work here. There's something seriously wrong here, I said to Jurgen, who looked up briefly from the road ahead to nod in agreement. Something doesn't smell right, he agreed, without a trace of irony. Have you seen the civilians? Now that he came to mention it, there were remarkably few of them lining the route. Shouts began to call from more unsavory types. a danger I felt relieve as we approached the Imperial compound. A voice came shouting out to me. The last time I had seen Torren Divas, he just made captain, and was nursing a hangover as he saw me off from the 12th Field Artillery. I remember thinking at the time, he was probably the only man in the battery who was sorry to see me go. There were streaks of grey at his temples now, I noticed, and his belt was out another notch, but the same air of boyish enthusiasm still hung around him, as on the day we first met. I enjoyed my catch-up, but relished the prospect of our situation leading to a Tau full-scale incursion. "We're already here," Divas said. Unfortunately, this was new and unwelcome information, and I goggled at him in surprise. "Since when?" I gasped. "About 6 months apparently. They were already deployed on the planet when the cleansing flame dropped us off here a few weeks ago. Now, if half of what I'd heard about Tau and their technology was true, we could be the ones getting our asses kicked." Divas grinned at my expression, misinterpreting it entirely. We left the Imperial compound, my commissar uniform more than enough to intimidate any who felt they could stand in our path. One thing I can say for Divas, he knew how to find a good bar. This one, the Eagle's Wing, the wide smoky cellar was full of Planetary Defense Force regulars, and were delighted to see some real soldiers at last, and were fulminating at the governor for not letting them loose on the aliens years ago. Divas kept the drinks flowing, drunk enough to voice the rumours of an Inquisitor upon Gravelax. We began walking back, Divas far drunker than I. The fool walked us through the hostile side of town, and it was then that trouble found us. About a dozen locals stood behind us, the streetlights striking highlights from their shaven heads. A variety of improvised weapons hanging purposely from their hands. They looked tough, at least in their own minds. But when you've been face to face with orcs and Eldar Reaver slavers, you don't intimidate that easily. "Believe me," I said to Divas, "you don't want to start anything. You don't get to tell me what I want." The group stepped forward, their spokesman stepping into the light. Blue paint was smothered across his face. Fine, I thought, keep him talking. That's what you Imperials do, isn't it? "I don't quite follow," I said, affecting mild curiosity. Movement out of the corner of my eye told me that our retreat had been cut off. The attack came in. I drew my las pistol and scored half the face of one. I drew my chainsword and whirled it about, but there were too many. A knee drove up into my ribs, slamming the breath from my lungs, and I was down. I felt the driving kicks and saw Divas had his own problems. A bird-like screech ended my torment, and the assailants parted. A bird-like humanoid Xenos stalked forward, helping me to my feet and speaking in strange Gothic. Whenever you don't have a clue of what's going on, I've always found it never hurts to be polite, and I thanked him for his help. "This does not advance the greater good," it said. "Disperse now, and avoid conflict." Well, that was a challenge if I'd ever heard one. But to my surprise and my intense relief, the little knot of troublemakers slunk away into the shadows. "I'm obliged to you," I said. I must admit I don't understand. My arm was swelling up now, and my fingers felt thick and unresponsive. My rescuer made a curious clicking sound, which I assumed to be its equivalent of laughter. "Imperial officers murdered by Tau supporters. Not a desirable outcome when the political situation is tense," he said. "I have the honor to be Gorok of the clan T'Cha," the creature said. "I am Kroot." "I know what you are," I said. "Kroot killed my parents, and thereby got me dumped into the Schola Progenium and thence into the Commissariat, instead of a lavish life. I couldn't say I regretted my choices, but it never hurts to grab the moral high ground." He looked troubled. "Go carefully, Commissar," he said, as he slunk off. And unfortunately that would not be the last time that we would meet. Lucky for me, Divas' mix of intoxication and beating meant he didn't recall the events of our scuffle. Another chance for me to play down my hero's reputation, having single-handedly beaten back our assailants. I made sure to constantly adjust the silk sling. The governor's palace was in what the locals called the Old Quarter, where the fad for Tau-influenced architecture, which had infected the rest of the city, had failed to take hold. I felt my spirits begin to rise, to the point where I almost began to anticipate enjoying the evening ahead of us. I was even more relieved to survive Jurgen's driving. I told my aide to watch the vehicle, The thought of Jurgen mixing with the cream of Gravalaxan aristocracy was almost too hideous to contemplate. The doors swung open to lavish guests, now screwing their eyeballs upon us. "I think we've made an impression," Castine murmured, as we gained the elaborately carved entrance doors. That was the idea. I agreed. I was reminded of how young the Colonel was in her nervousness, but reassurance from me, and surprisingly Brocklaw, rallied her. Inside, it was exactly as I anticipated. The kind of vulgar ostentation too many of the wealthy mistake for good taste, with crystal and gilt and garish tapestries of historic battles, and smug-looking Primarchs strewn around the place like a pirate's warehouse. "Governor Grice," I said, bowing formally. "A pleasure. Of all the planetary governors I have met, Grice seemed to take the cake. Probably literally. For such a rotund and garish figure before me was almost hard to look at. For once in my life, my hero's reputation seemed to be entirely ignored, as the lardy governor was completely locked upon Castine and her red hair. It enabled me to fade out of the picture and go looking for some amusement of my own. A young woman was standing on a podium at the end of the room, surrounded by musicians who sounded almost as well rehearsed as our regimental band. But they could have been playing orc war drums for all I cared, because her voice was extraordinary. She was singing old sentimental favourites. I felt my eyes drifting in her direction every time the crowd parted, enough to afford me a view. She was tall and slim, with shoulder-length hair of a shade of blonde I'd never seen on anyone else before or since, hanging loose to frame a face which nearly stopped my heart. Her eyes were the hazy blue of a far horizon, and seemed to transfix me wherever I looked in her direction. "I heard you nearly started the war early," said a voice from behind me. "Erasmus Donali, Imperial Envoy." The introduction wasn't necessary, for I had never seen an outfit that screamed diplomat more. "Not from choice, I can assure you," I said, just defending an officer who lacked the self-restraint to ignore a blatant piece of sedition. "I see," he said. He eyed me narrowly, trying to size me up. I kept my expression neutral. "I take it your self-restraint is a little stronger," he said. "At the moment," I said, choosing my words with care. "We're still at peace with the Tau." "I can see your reputation is far from exaggerated," he said, as we shook hands. His dislike of the imbecilic Governor Grice that leered at Castine was apparent. Supposedly this whole Cold War between the Tau and the Imperium was his fault. He got so carried away counting his bribes from the likes of him. Erasmus tilted his head to the far corner of the room, that he hardly even noticed his planet slipping out from under him, he finished. A cadaverous hawk-nosed individual, dressed in unwise scarlet hose and a burgundy tabard, was holding forth to a knot of local aristocracy. "One of the rogue traders we've heard so much about," I said, as he shrugged. "So he says, but no one hears entirely what they seem, Commissar. You can certainly depend on that," he said. We drifted apart as I met eyes with Castine. She had seemed to embrace her newfound confidence, as a fob of nobles seemed to follow around her.
"It looks like you've lost your date,"
a voice said behind me. I turned, and found myself falling into the wide blue eyes of the singer I'd been watching before. Uncharacteristically for me, I was momentarily at a loss for words. She was smiling, a plate of finger food in her hand.
"She's, just a colleague. A fellow officer. Nothing like that between us. Strictly against regulations, for one thing. And anyway, we're not..."
She laughed, a warm, smoky chuckle that warmed me like Amasek, and I realized she was pulling my leg.
"I know. No time for romance in the Imperial Guard. It must be grim for you."
"We have our duty to the Emperor. For a soldier, that's enough."
It's the sort of thing I usually say, and most civilians lap it up. But my beautiful singer was looking at me quizzically, the ghost of a smile quirking at the corner of her mouth, and I suddenly got the feeling that she could see right through me to the core of deceit and self-interest I normally keep concealed from the world. It was an unnerving sensation.
For some, maybe. But I think there's more to you than meets the eye.
She picked up a bottle from the nearby table with her free hand, and topped up my glass.
"There's more to everyone, than meets the eye,
I said, more to deflect the conversation than anything else. She smiled again.
That's very astute, Commissar.
She extended a hand, slim and cool to the touch. The middle finger ornamented with a large and finely wrought ring of unusual workmanship. Evidently she was extremely successful in her position, or had at least one wealthy admirer. I would have laid money on both. I kissed it formally, as etiquette demanded, and to my astonishment she giggled.
A gentleman as well as an officer. You are full of surprises.
Then she surprised me by dropping a curtsy, in intimation of the bovine debutantes surrounding us. The light of mischief was in her dazzling eyes.
I'm Amberly Vale, by the way. I sing a bit.
I know, and very well too.
She acknowledged the compliment with a tilt of her head. I bowed formally, entering into the game.
Ciaphas Cain, at your service. Currently attached to the Valhallan 597th.
Her eyes widened a little as I introduced myself.
I've heard of you.
She said a little breathlessly.
Didn't you fight the Gene Stealers on Kefir?
Well, I had. If you count hanging around drinking recaf, while the artillery unit I was with dropped shells in the biggest concentrations of Stealers we could find, from kilometers away as fighting. I've been in at the death, so to speak, and emerged with a great deal of the credit, more by luck than good judgment. It was one of the early incidents that had laid the foundations for my undeserving reputation. But my misadventures since had tended to overshadow what most of the galaxy still regarded as a minor incident on a backwater agri-world.
Not entirely alone,
I said, slipping easily into the modest hero demeanor I could adopt without thinking.
There was an Imperial battle fleet in orbit at the time.
And 2 full divisions of Imperial Guard on planet.
She laughed again, at my astonished expression.
I have relatives in Skanderberg 17th. You're still talked about back there.
I can't think why. I was just doing my job.
Of course.
Amberly nodded, and again I got the feeling that she wasn't fooled for a moment.
You're an Imperial Commissar. Duty before everything, right?
Absolutely. And right now, I think it's my duty to ask you to dance.
It was a transparent attempt to change the subject, which I'd hoped she'd put down to modest embarrassment. I half expected her to refuse, but she smiled, discarding her plate of half-eaten delicacies, and took my uninjured arm.
I'd love to. I have a few minutes before my second set.
So we drifted across to the dance floor, and I spent a very pleasant few minutes with her head on my shoulder, as we spun around to an old waltz I had never learned the name of. I noticed a quiet, vehement altercation between Grice and the hawk-faced rogue trader.
Do you know who that is?
I asked, not really expecting an answer, but it seemed my companion was well versed in the intricacies of Gavalaxian politics. It came with performing for the aristocracy, I supposed.
His name's Aurelius, a rogue trader here to deal with the Tau, so he says.
The qualification was delivered in precisely the same tone of skepticism as Donali's had been, and for some reason I found myself remembering Divis's cloak and dagger fantasies about our night in the Eagle Wing.
Why do you say that?
I asked. Amberly shrugged.
The Tau have been dealing with the same traders for more than a century. Aurelius arrived from nowhere a month or 2 ago, and tried opening negotiations with them through Grice. It may just be a coincidence, but...
She shrugged, her dress slipping across her slim shoulders.
Why, now, with the political situation destabilizing?
She nodded.
It does seem a little unusual.
Perhaps he's hoping to take advantage of the confusion to strike a better deal,
I said. Aurelius turned on his heel as I watched, and marched away trailed by his bodyguards. Grice was pale and sweating, even more than usual, and he reached out to pluck a drink from a nearby servitor with a trembling hand.
He's thrown a scare into our illustrious governor, at any event.
Has he?
Amberly watched him go.
That seems a little presumptuous, even for a rogue trader.
If that's what he really is,
I said, without thinking. Those deathless blue eyes turned on me again.
What else would he be?
An inquisitor,
I said, the idea taking firmer root in my head even as I said it. Amberly's eyes widened.
An inquisitor? Here?
Her voice became a little tremulous, as though the enormity of the idea was too huge to grasp.
What makes you think that?
The urge to impress her was almost irresistible, I have to confess. And if you could only know how bewitching she was, I know you would have felt the same. so I looked my most commissarial.
All I can say is that I've heard from a reliable military source that there are Inquisition agents active on Gravelax.
Which sounded a lot better than from a drunken idiot.
Surely not.
She shook her head, blonde tresses flying in confusion. This does not advance the greater good, I said, echoing the words of the Kroot. I wasn't quite sure what they meant, but I hoped they had more resonance for the Tau than yet any variation on, put it down before I shoot you. The noble guests, the Tau delegation, and especially the one frantically waving the pistol looked at me stunned. So much for a delightful evening. The bark of a bolt pistol going off had echoed around the ballroom, as I had dived for cover behind an overstuffed sofa, even before the rational part of my mind had identified the source of the sound. I may not be a paragon of virtue, but I like to think that my survival instincts more than make up for any moral shortcomings I might possess. The Tau's delegation had only been within the chamber mere moments, when Oran Shui Sasai, ambassador of the Tau, had been assassinated. Gravelax had just exploded into pandemonium right in front of our eyes. One of the other Tau dignitaries, clearly distraught, drew a pistol and was mere moments away from losing it into Governor Grice's face. That's when I stepped forward. My brash movement and words worked better than I dare hoped. Every Tau in the group, including the maniac with the gun, stared at me with something I took to be astonishment. Their faces are harder to read than human or Eldar, but it gets easier the more practice you have. What do you know of the greater good? The Tau asked, lowering his weapon a fraction, but keeping Grice covered nevertheless. His companions hesitated, clearly wondering if it was safe to disarm him yet. Not much, I admitted, but adding more deaths to tonight's piece of treachery won't help anyone, surely. My name is Cain, I said, and the whisper of voices around me echoed it. That's him, that's Ciaphas Cain. The reaction seemed to bemuse my new friend. Commissar Cain is well known as a man of integrity, a new voice cut in. The rogue trader, or possible inquisitor, Aurelius, was edging his way through the crowd. I leaned on my reputation, slowly calming the Tau entourage down from the precipice. Did you see the governor with a gun? I pressed them. He might have concealed it, spat one of them. True. Grice's overly ornamented robes might have concealed almost anything there, voluminous folds. But I tried to picture that indecent lump of lard drawing a pistol. It is more likely sourced from the hundreds in the crowd around us. Erasmus Donali, the Imperial diplomat, promised there would be an Imperial investigation and justice, stepping forward to appease them. It was clear the Tau trusted Imperial promises about as far as they could throw them. The situation became worse. I almost believed it was my fault the assassination had let slip on my Vox, until information came in. A force was outside and preparing to siege the governor's palace. A conspiracy, I whispered. The murderer had confederates who were spreading the rumor even before he struck. This wasn't meant to just disrupt the negotiations. It was supposed to signal a full-scale revolt. The Tau signaled for their own transportation, which would take time to arrive. Governor Grice offered his own guard, bedecked in jewels and gold, but equipped with almost ceremonial weapons and about 2 brain cells between them. The Tau emissaries looked less than impressed. I believe the commissar arrived with an honor guard, Aurelius said. Surely a man of his reputation can be trusted with so delicate a task. Thanks a lot, I thought. But with that reputation at stake, all I could do was muster something about it being an honor I didn't deserve. Which was perfectly true, of course. Be on your guard, Castine warned them. The assassin is still at large, so trust no one apart from us. There's a mob of rioters heading this way, and a PDF platoon with orders to secure the palace grounds. When they get here, it'll be bloody. That was right, for I had witnessed firsthand the eagerness of the PDF to bludgeon Riley citizens. I listened to the Vox traffic. We had 10 minutes before an angry mob was here to rip the Tau, Imperials, and most importantly me, apart. I called Jurgen to bring around the transport, arriving with his usual disdain for the conventional use of brakes and gears. I saw 2 squadrons led by Officer Lustig. The discipline of the mixed Valhallan teams was a pride that swelled within me. Our spirits lifted, as away from the palace we saw the Tau transports roaring in. But I felt my stomach lurch, as a missile launched from the city punched into its underside. It fell in fire. The sound of Tau accusations grew in my ear. Sudden realization hit me like a punch in the gut. One thing to be said for being paranoid is that sometimes you begin to see patterns no one else can. Killing the ambassador was meant to make them run. The mobs in the street were meant to leave them with nowhere to go. They're supposed to only have one option now. And if we called in the Tau military, these conspirators would get exactly what they wanted. Open war. Then we must die, El Sarath said, as though he'd been suggesting a stroll through the park. The greater good demands it. His companions looked sober, but none of them argued. We, however, preferred them alive and well, for the continued talks and deals. I made the most bizarre declaration of my life. I put on my hero's smile and vowed to get the Xenos to safety. We'd left the governor's palace as soon as we could get the Tau aboard our truck, scrambling over the tailgate in the flickering light from the burning buildings. Lustig's squad split into teams again, 5 on each side, leaving the Xenos diplomats in the middle. It wasn't exactly high security, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. More news had come in, that even within the PDF whole regiment had risen in revolt, leaving us the sad affair of not knowing who was friend or foe. We actually seemed to be making good headway through the burning city, until a scruffy man stepped out in front of our transport. Who goes there? He was young, I noticed. His face still pitted with acne scars, and his helmet looked too big for his head. A lieutenant of the PDF. Colonel Castine, Valhallan 597th, and Commissar Cain. Castine leaned out of the cab window to talk to him. Order your men aside. I can't do that. His jaw took on a stubborn set. I'm sorry? Really? Castine looked at him as though she just found him on the sole of her boot. I was under the impression that a colonel outranks a lieutenant. Isn't that so, Commissar? In my experience, I agreed. I leaned past her to address the young pup directly. Or do you do things differently on Gravelax? He paled visibly, as I raked him with the number 2 glare. I thought we were through and clear, until the lieutenant made a sly comment. El Hasayoff of the Tau jumped out and berated the PDF, unfortunately now clearly visible to the young lieutenant and his PDF troopers. Blueies, he yelped. Traitors, Xenos lovers, were screamed at us. The lieutenant ordered us to hand over our blueies. I unfastened my las pistol. The Xenos are under the Imperial Guard protection, I said levelly. And that means mine. Stand aside in the Emperor's name or face the consequences. I had gotten used to my uniform inspiring authority. The boy lieutenant and his undisciplined mob prepared to raise their weapons. He ordered his sergeants to take the blueies. Lustig, I said. Fire. Even as I spoke, I was leveling the las pistol. The lieutenant's eyes widened for a fraction of a second as he began to turn back to us, the glint of vindictive triumph giving way to a momentary panic, and then half of his face was gone as I squeezed the trigger. Our las rifles flicked up and began cutting them down. Jurgen powered forward and rammed through their makeshift barricade, the sound of bone crunching beneath our tread. Castine and Lustig mopped up the rest. We were very silent for the rest of the journey. I have killed many in my over a century service to the Commissariat. It was part of the role to maintain Imperial discipline. Despite that, I've always tried my best to avoid using lethal force. I don't know how many I have killed, but that was the first night I didn't sleep easy. Seeing the terrified look of that over-eager lieutenant clearly out of his depth. We trudged through the rest of the city. Bodies were scattered everywhere, which reminded me of a chaos incursion, not civil unrest. It was as night came that we finally arrived at the Tau base. The Vox-enhanced voice of one of their watercasts parted the crowd with a simple, "Please desist, for the greater good." As we dropped off the emissaries, we caught sight of the machinery and weapons. I was beyond relieved we weren't engaging. The prospect of our Valhallans against what looked like to be mobile Astartes dreadnoughts made both me and Castine shiver. I did a much better job at hiding my feelings though. I had a lot of practice. I felt relief flood me as we departed. "Frack off," I shouted, after the knocking on my door had finally become loud and insistent enough to wake me. I had barely an hour's sleep since returning. I thought it was Jurgen bringing me another cup of Tanner tea, a bitter drink favoured mostly by the Valhallans. Brocklaw popped his head into my tent, telling me someone wanted to speak to me. If I hadn't been so tired, I probably would have wondered about the number of high-ranking officers in the echoing marble corridors, and the increasing opulence of the furnishings and the succession of anterooms. I was waved through by dress-uniformed troopers with gold-plated lasguns, but it all passed in a haze of irritation, and I never thought to question where I was and who had sent for me so brazenly. I walked into a command tent to a mixed bunch. "Sorry I missed all the fun," I said, playing up to the audience's expectations of me. My gaze swept across a couple of majors, a colonel, and as I got my first good look at the man seated at the head of the table, I almost dropped my cutlery. This could only be Lord General Zyvan himself, the supreme commander of our little expedition. "Don't be," he said. "You did us a far greater service last night than you could have possibly done by staying." "I'm glad to hear it," I said, "but you seem to have managed all right. The palace guard must be better soldiers than they look." "Hardly." He shook his head in disgust. "Commissar." Zyvan addressed me directly. "Thank you for joining us so promptly." "My Lord General." I nodded a formal greeting. "If I had known your chef was so talented, I would have been even less tardy," I added, enjoying the sudden intake of breath from around half those present. "I'll pass on your compliments," he said with a half smile. I think more than my words that my actions last night had impressed him more. General Zyvan began the meeting, surmising our situation. Open conflict with the Tau was quite frankly not worth the value of Gravelax, and the assassination and uprising were clearly linked. That was why I was invited. I voiced my suspicions of a wider conspiracy, sure that Governor Grice was too much of an imbecile to be involved, for it seemed almost accidentally he had been playing the Tau, the Imperium and that rogue trader. I had my own suspicions confirmed to me that an Inquisitor was on Gravelax. The holo displays came up, as General Zyvan illuminated the next disaster, the rebelling PDF, their own loyalist half refusing to attack their own, leaving the idiot Governor Grice thinking himself a hero and sending his palace guard. No doubt to be seen by the Tau as an escalation. Hot war was a breath away. He turned to me. "Commissar, would you say that the Tau have reason to trust you?" Well, of course they didn't, but that wasn't what he wanted to hear, so I nodded judiciously. More than most other Imperial officers, I suppose. I did save them a bit of a walk last night. As I had expected, my modest joking at my own expense went down well, fitting these idiots' idea of a hero. Zyvan looked pleased. "Good," he said. "We can inform the Tau that Commissar Cain will be overseeing the operation personally." My palms began to itch. The Valhallan mixed regiments of the 597th, along with elements from my old 12th Artillery, began to siege the last traitor elements of the PDF. A remarkably easier assignment compared to the Tyranids they had fought before I had joined. I noticed a loyalist PDF blockade of a few had blocks and offered my services to see what was holding them up. And by the time I'd finished the extra piece of make work I just found for myself, Castine and Brocklaw should have the Xenuist survivors pretty much dealt with. If all went well, most of the dust would have been settled before I got anywhere near the firing line. It seemed my luck hadn't deserted me after all. I promised to be back before the final push. How could I not? They had seen Jurgen's driving. The harder and the faster you go in, the better. I concluded my briefing speech, breaking off to glare at Sulla, who whispered something to her neighbour and giggled. I said to leave when I heard a voice. "Commissar?" I turned, momentarily startled by the voice at my elbow. Sulla was still seated, her face flushed with uncharacteristic nervousness. "I just wanted to say..." She hesitated again, then blurted it out in a rush. "I know that you haven't formed a very high opinion of me since you joined us, but I appreciate you giving me a chance. You won't regret it, I promise you." I smiled warmly, wondering what the frack she was on about. I watched her trot off to get prepared for the engagement. I mounted the command Salamander Jurgen had procured and looked out over the expeditionary force. Feeling a surge of pride despite the upcoming danger, I, Jurgen, Castine, Brocklaw, Lustig and Sulla set forth to our targets as our artillery came alive. I and Jurgen along with our squadron approached the PDF quadrant, only to hear lasfire ahead. It was the Inquisitor. One of the foppish PDF lieutenants gasped. I saw 6 4 men and 2 women, he said. I surmised my thoughts on a conspiracy that had been followed up by that of Aurelius, and perhaps just ahead below a warehouse they had found something. I grabbed the flamer and my chainsaw from the salamander and moved up on foot. Behind debris and clearly masked in civilian clothing, I saw our enemy. I triggered the flamer, sending a gout of burning promethium down the alley. The results were impressive. Crates burst into flames, and the rebels behind them got caught in the backwash. They burst into the open, their clothes and hair on fire, shrieking like the damned, and Jurgen cut them down with the bolter. "Let's finish this," I said, and my aide gunned the engine, rolling us forward over the pools of burning promethium, which now carpeted the alley. As I glanced behind us, the PDF officer was gazing at the devastation we'd wrought, his eyes wide with shock. We pushed in further as flames spread to the other buildings. More loyalist PDF troopers emerged, stunned. "Commissar, the Inquisitor's team are pinned down inside the warehouse. They want immediate extraction," the officer said. It was with cold realization that I was the one who set the very fire that put a member of the Emperor's Holy Inquisition in danger, and my usual sensible aversion to putting myself in harm's way was utterly useless before a firing squad. "Jurgen, take us in," I voxed, as the salamander began to roll forward once more. We burst through a sheet steel cargo door. Flames rose from every quarter as thick smoke immediately smothered me. I coughed, tore off my sash and tied it around my face. It didn't do a lot of good, to be honest, but my lungs felt a little less choked than before. "Frack this," I said, on the verge of ordering Jurgen to withdraw. Then I caught sight of a small knot of figures hurrying towards us. I pointed, and Jurgen swung the salamander around, stopping us almost dead. I saw Aurelius. He paused over the corpse of a muscled man, and then picked up running. I clambered to the top-mounted bolter and raked munitions through the smoke towards the figures behind the running 5. "Jurgen!" I shouted. "Help the women!" Aurelius took a lasbolt to the shoulder, dropping his handgun. I wasn't about to lose him now, not after going through all this, so I jumped down, drawing my las pistol and went to help him. "Commissar Cain?" He looked slightly confused until I remembered my makeshift smoke mask and pulled it down. It wasn't doing a damn bit of good anyway. The whole building around us was ablaze, the heat terrific. "I heard you needed a lift," I said. He's nothing, nothing, one of the women shrieked at the touch of Jurgen. I hadn't thought this was the time to complain about my aide's smell, but with the last of them in, I yelled, "Jurgen, get us out of here." He opened the throttle fully. "With pleasure, Commissar," he said. The salamander leapt forwards, breaking for the shattered loading door we'd come by in. We departed the war zone as I voxed. "The Inquisitor is safe." "So I am." The woman in black dropped her hood, revealing a face I'd thought about often in the last few days. Amberly Vale gazed at me with what I took to be faint amusement as my jaw dropped open, an inquisitorial lectu flashing into visibility in the palm of her hand. "Thank you, Commissar," she added, smiling sweetly. I sat in a quiet booth at the back of the Eagle's Wing. The place was almost deserted, in an eerie contrast to my visit here with Divas. Brocklaw had briefed me of their rounding success, even a daring act by Janet Sulla, who trotted off blushing after I gave her praise. I was alone, and resting until company joined me. "May I join you?" Amberly Vale said. "Feel free." I gestured to the waitress, who looked vaguely disappointed as she delivered our order. "2 more, please." "Thank you." Amberly sipped delicately at the drink. I think it only really hit me now just how close to death I had come over the previous days, and my utter failure at avoiding that fate. "You're a remarkable man, Commissar." "So I've been told, though I can't see it myself." The corner of Amberly's mouth twitched, and with what looked like genuine amusement. "Oh yes, the modest hero routine. You've got that one off pat. No question." She knocked back the rest of her drink in one, and signalled for another, leaving me gaping like an idiot. Her smile widened. "What's next?" "I'm just a humble soldier." She flashed a grin of pure mischief at me. "Lighten up, Commissar. I'm only pulling your leg." And in the process letting me know she saw right through me. "You could just try to be yourself, you know," she said. The thought was terrifying. I spent so long hiding behind masks, I was no longer sure there was a genuine Ciaphas under them anymore. Just a quivering bundle of self-interest. Then an even more terrifying thought hit me. She could tell what I was thinking. Everything I tried to conceal about my fraudulent reputation would be open to her and the Inquisition. Emperor's bowels. Relax, I'm not a psycho. Just very good at reading people. She watched me sag into my seat with relief, not even trying to conceal it, the faint amusement still dancing in the back of her eyes. Then came the worst part. She asked for my help. You deal with aliens, I hazarded. Amberley Vale of the Ordos Xenos, she explained. I, Amberley, and General Zyvan were gathered, around in a much more private meeting. Amberley pulled up a star chart onto the hololith, which I recognised without too much difficulty, as it had been produced in far less detail in the briefing slate I'd skimmed through before we'd made planetfall. The Damocles Gulf, I said, and she nodded. We're here. She pointed out the Gravelax system, seemingly alone and isolated on the fringes of Imperial space. Notice anything about the topography of the region? We're close to the Tau border, I said, playing for time as I studied the images. Too close, I concluded finally. If we had to fight a war here, our supply lines would be far too thin for comfort. Precisely. Zyvan nodded approval, which is why we're desperate to avoid a full-scale war over this miserable mudball, Amberley said. It became clear Gravelax and other worlds like it could be emboldened by a Tau uprising, causing Imperial resources to be diverted from potential enemies in the sectors, such as a new Tyranid Hive fleet, and the Necrons. I shuddered at their mention. Governor Grice and his corruption was not surprising, but our bigger concern was these conspirators. They sought to drag the Imperium and Tau into an open conflict that, quite frankly, both sides wanted to avoid for now. The real question was, who were these conspirators? Do you have any clue to their identities? Zyvan asked. Amberley shook her head, but that was the reason they were under the warehouse. It hadn't occurred to me, but Amberley, that the conspirators' source was in the Undercity, something that as a hive rat myself I was familiar with, but I never imagined Gravelax would possess. We'll need to move fast and light, Amberley said. One fire team, and the commissar to lead them. She turned those dazzling eyes on me again and smiled. I'm sure a man of your formidable reputation will be up to the challenge. I wasn't, but you can take my word for it. But I couldn't refuse a direct request from an Inquisitor, could I? So I nodded and tried to look more confident. You can rely on me, I said, with all the sincerity I could fake. And from the grin that quirked in the corner of her mouth, I could tell she wasn't fooled for a second. With Amberley's retinue injured and out of action, we were the next best thing. I'll ask for volunteers, I said, but she shook her head. No need. You've already assigned some. I looked at the data slate. Kelp, Trebek, Valade, Sorel, and Hollenby. The 5 troopers responsible for the mess hall riot. The only troopers on the planet I'd least trust to watch my back. My palms were itching. My inbuilt warning system that said my life was very much fracked. Castine and Brocklor came to send me off, both equally surprised and concerned at the Inquisitor's choice. I was desperately hoping this wasn't the suicide mission my heartbeat was drumming to. My aide Jurgen walked to us across the room. A faint expression of nausea ghosted across Brocklor's face. I'd like to go with you, sir, he said at last. I was touched. I don't mind admitting it. We'd been campaigning together for the best part of 13 years by that point, and faced innumerable perils together, but his loyalty never ceased to amaze me. Thank you, Jurgen, I said. I'd be honoured. He seemed to flush. He turned and rushed to get his equipment, giving the closest thing he could to a viable salute in a uniform that, despite measuring, still looked baggy and oversized. I found that other than myself, Jurgen was the only being in this galaxy I completely trusted. Most people tended to avoid him, put off by his appearance and body odor, and the vague sense of wrongness he exuded. But I'd been close to him for so long, I'd gotten used to seeing past that, to his well-hidden virtues, though I was the last person you'd normally expect to appreciate them. Kelp, Trebek, Valade, Sorel and Hollenby lined up before me and Amberley. All of their faces looked panicked. all except Sorel's, whose eyes still made me shudder. I take it we aren't expected to survive. Kelp cut in. Amberly met his eyes, staring him down. That rather depends on you, she said. The Commissar certainly intends to. I suggest you follow his lead. Plus the rewards was freedom from a penal legion. So, to recap, Kelp said, you want us to go into an unmapped labyrinth, looking for something you think might be down there, but you don't know what, protected by an intermediate number of heavily armed guards, and the last time you tried you were the only one who made it out in one piece? That about sums it up, yes, Amberly admitted cheerfully. But you are forgetting one thing. Which is? I asked. This time, they'll be expecting us, she said. What's to stop any of us putting a lasbolt through your head and disappearing over the horizon the first chance we get? Sorel asked. Good point. Amberly smiled. I'll execute any one of you who even looks like they're thinking of making a run for it, I chimed in. Even if you can't take us both. And the amusement was abruptly gone from her voice. I sincerely doubt that. I've lost count to the number of people I've met who thought they could outrun the Inquisition. But you might as well give it a try if you really want to. Sorel nodded. Their mood seemed to pick up, as a raid before them was the finest equipment in the regiment. A gift for a line trooper. It was the first time I saw emotion flicker in Sorel's eyes as he nodded to me, happy with the procurement of his personal sniper. Hell, I even tapped on a layer of body armor myself for added protection. As we packed up, it became clear that there was an entanglement between Hollenby and Valade. Aww, Amberly mouthed. How sweet. Maybe to her, I thought. But to me it was little more than another potential complication in a catastrophe just waiting to happen. The expedition was ready and set off. Let me tell you, if I'd known then what awaited us in the undercity of Mayo, I probably would have broken down in hysterics from sheer terror. It wasn't long into our journey that we heard the news. The imbecile Governor Grice had ordered combat readiness, despite the stalling of General Ivan. We approached the smoky remains of the warehouse, lumbering down into a hatch Amberly and her retinue had escaped from, only to find a makeshift barrier. Jurgen leveled his melter rifle, a rather monstrous piece of gear that could punch through even tank plate. Kelp and Sorel ran back, as Amberly stopped him in his tracks. Right idea though, I said, seeing his crestfallen expression. Valade, Hollenby, front and center. 5 rounds rapid. Our path was open. I assembled the squad quickly. Kelp, I said, you're on point. He nodded but didn't look happy. Then Sorel, Valade, Jurgen, me, the Inquisitor. Hollenby, Trebek has rear. That ought to keep the biggest potential troublemakers as far apart as possible, and separate the two lovebirds just enough to keep their minds on the job instead of each other. We proceeded in silence for some time, until Sorel held up a hand, warning us to stop. Amberly and I padded over to join him. Movement, he said, pointing away into the darkness ahead of us. Amberly checked the screen on her auspex. Nothing. Growing up in a hive city, you learn a few things. I pushed my hearing to its greatest sensitivity, drowning out the beating of my own heart. I picked up on gunfire, on the edge of my perception. We pushed forward into the dark again, my own senses telling me we were pushing deep into the earth of Gravelax. The crackle of gunfire had disappeared as we found a pile of human corpses, plasma scars evident on some. It was in that moment I saw a glow from the corner of my eye, rocket past and land on a crate next to us. I'm proud to say that despite the suddenness of the attack, my intellectual faculties remained undimmed, which isn't to say that I didn't dive for the nearest piece of cover the instant I realised we were under fire, of course. The rest dove into cover next to me, as now an unending stream of plasma pinged around us. I knew that despite the layers of body armour stacked upon me, a plasma would pierce straight through, much to my dread. Jurgen, I shouted. Can you get a shot? Not yet, Commissar. He was tucked behind a barricade of crates. The melter gun rested across it, covering the tunnel entrance. I have movement, Sorel said calmly, sighting carefully down the barrel of his longlads. He pulled the trigger. It was then that I heard a unique scream, one I had last heard on a drunken stroll back to camp, saving me from a savage beating from blue-painted morons. That was Kroot. I said, in stunned amazement. Now it was Ambly's turn to look taken aback. Are you sure? She asked. I nodded. I've spoken to one. I expected her to query it, but instead she stood. To my utter shock, she strode into the middle of the chamber and hissed something in the Tau's foul language. I clearly wasn't the only one to be astonished by this, as the incoming fire ceased immediately, after a tense pause. She answered in the same tongue and gestured to me. Stand down and show yourselves, she said. They want to talk. Despite my instincts, I stood with the others, anticipating a plasma round to the chest. Despite our expedition being in the gloom and dark for hours, I had trouble adjusting into the Tau were right in front of us. I shuddered at the image of their robotic-like helms covering their faces. I am pleased to find you in good health, Commissar Cain. Well, you're probably thinking I'm pretty dense, not to have recognized Gorok straight away, but you should bear all the circumstances in mind. Why in the galaxy should I have expected him to be there in the first place? His use of my name had an immediate and somewhat gratifying effect on the Tau, whose head snapped around to stare at me. Then the leader turned back to Ambly and asked something. Gorok made the particular clicking laughter equivalent I'd heard before. The notion that my reputation had somehow filtered to what the Tau called their firecast was amusing. I bowed formally to the leading chasseur. He states that your service to the greater good is remembered with gratitude. Gorok translated helpfully. El Zorath remains in good health. Pleased to hear it, I said, tactically refraining from hoping out loud that El Hassai, the gun-waving lunatic, wasn't. Ambly conferred with Gorok and the chasseur and came back with a rather amusing proposal. It seemed that the Tau were down here for the same reason, and it served the greater good to team up. Team up with the Blue East? Kelp was outraged. You can't be serious. That's blasphemy. That's what the Inquisitor wants. Live with it, I said. Despite the blasphemy, I was rather pleased with the idea of having more guns and bodies between me and any potential threat, which meant my chances of survival just went up. So we formed up, the Tau leading, which was fine by me. Let them suck up any of the fire from ambushes. I was sure to be lurking in the dark ahead of us. It was only Kelp whose protest fell on deaf ears. Apparently the Kroot had lost one to Sorel, but they seemed very matter-of-fact, even impressed by the kill. Sorel, overhearing, looked quietly pleased at the compliment. In stealth we moved up. Unnervingly, the Kroot disappeared from sight, and reappeared later, holding corpses in their arms. They began to bite and consume parts of the human flesh, much to our, and even the Tau's disgust. But then they spat them out, Gorok informing us they were tainted like the others, like their very genes were tainted. Ambly nodded to herself, as though it confirmed something she suspected. And a terrible realization hit me, the nagging memories of some previous campaign. Suddenly I knew what she expected to find down here, and it was all I could do not to turn on my heels and run, screaming for the surface. We pushed in deeper, more cautiously now, the near pitch black and heavy moisture of the tunnels almost chokingly familiar. Ambly wanted to push on despite my warnings. She wanted confirmation, but I knew that what we were potentially facing could turn on us in an instant. We might have a bit of an edge ourselves, she said, glancing at Jurgen. And I remember thinking that one melter gun wasn't going to make that much of a difference. But, of course, it did in the end, and that wasn't the edge she'd been thinking of in any case. After 3 more kilometers we found an opening. The chamber was huge, vaulted tens of meters over our heads, like the school at chapel where I spent many droll and draughty hours as a juvie, listening to old chaplains droning on about duty and loyalty to the Emperor, and furtively swapping salacious holopics with the other cadets. But the atmosphere here was about as far from musty piety as it was possible to get. However, palpable danger seeped from every corner. Emperor's bones, Trebek muttered. There's an entire army of them down there. A few short, sibilant exclamations from among the Tau were enough to confirm that they too were unpleasantly surprised at what we seen. It's worse than that, Kelp muttered. They're mutants, Sorel said. No, they're not, Jurgen chipped in helpfully, blissfully unaware of my frantic shut up hand gestures as he shaded his eyes for a closer look. They're gene stealers. They're gene stealer hybrids. We saw plenty of them on Kefia, and his voice trailed off lamely as he finally turned his head in my direction and saw the expression on my face. Kelp's jaw clenched. You knew. It was a flat statement, an accusation, and all the others hung on his words. You knew what was waiting down here all along, and you let us right in to get slaughtered. No one's getting slaughtered unless I do it. I snapped back. It all seemed to click in place. The rebelling half of the PDF now engaged with the Tau. The conspiracy to bring the Imperium and Tau Empire into conflict. It was these gene stealers, the infiltration arm of the greater Tyranid threat. Kelp ran off, threatening to kill anyone who stopped him, and I couldn't kill him unless I attracted the horde below. The Chasui is saying it could be most prudent to divide our forces again. Gorok translated helpfully. Big surprise there, I thought. If I was the Chasui and just seen one of our allies pull a gun on his commander, I'd be having second thoughts about our little arrangement now too. It didn't matter. We needed to pull out and inform General Zyvan. They ain't flesh, Gorok screamed. They must not taste ours. My bowels froze. I saw what looked almost like a man carry the severed head of the Kroot Sorel had shot earlier. They were preparing to eat it when our Kroot allies, at the sight of the blasphemy, charged them. We ran. The Tau refusing to pull back as they traded plasma shots into a swarm of beady eyes and claws. We pounded to the entrance we had used, until my heart froze with terror. I had seen too many on Kefir, as part of the screaming mass of Tyranid army, to mistake it for anything else. A pure strain gene stealer, one of the deadliest creatures in creation, and it wasn't alone. A blast of superheated air roared past my face, vaporizing the oncoming stealer and chewing a chunk out of the front ranks. Jurgen had already raised his weapon. Keep your distance, I shouted. The hybrids were hoping to pin us in, allowing the pure strains to close. We mowed down the pure strains in front. I, Amberley, Jurgen, Trebek, Valade and Hollenby all darting forward, as Sorel shot a suspended Promethean tank. We didn't turn to watch the fire behind us. The chittering mixed in with human screams and dying Tau were plenty warning. I was the last to leave, as the group began to divide into a mad rush through the tunnels. It was after what felt like hours, but probably minutes, that I found myself alone. As I entered the welcoming darkness, the panic I tried to force down resurfaced, stronger than before, and try as I could to make myself slow down and get my bearings, fear had control of my limbs now. I ran as hard and as fast as I could, until my body almost gave out. I was alone, but corridors like these had been my playground as a child, and I'd never quite lost the knack for finding my way around them, so not all hope had abandoned me. I rested, taking out my canteen, and trying to get my breath under control. I heard a scrape to my side, and immediately sucked in a held breath. Inquisitor? I asked cautiously. Inquisitor, you wish. The voice was close and harsh, and if Kelp had been able to resist the taunt, the rifle butt which had followed it would have probably stove in my skull. As it was, he'd been considerate enough to warn me, so I ducked it easily, and drove my fist into the pit of his stomach. We tussled, until he drove kicks into me and I fell. He screamed at me as I desperately tried to fend him off. I pushed him back and slunk into the shadows, drawing my chainsword. If you're going to fight, fight, I said, using the sound of my voice to draw him in, and mask the whine of the blade as it powered up. Don't make speeches. He must have thought he had me, because he charged in with a roar of triumph. I slashed him across the leg, sending him reeling. I went to advance when he raised his gun at my chest. Commissar? I heard the distinct voice of Amberley at our side, and the rest of the group fanning around us. Jurgen, kill him, I said. The expression on Kelp's face was almost comical, for the half second or so that he still had one. Then he exploded into a small pile of gently steaming offal. I turned to my aide, who was lowering the melter rifle, and nodded with acknowledgement. Thank you, I added. You're welcome, sir, he replied. Amberley smiled. You seem to have the situation well in hand, she said. I shrugged. I've faced worse odds. We pushed on quickly again, following a run of piping which seemed to be tending upwards. But I couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over me as we trotted through the dark. One thing I'd learned from my previous encounter with the creatures, they were remarkably stealthy and preferred to strike from the shadows. It was in that very moment I had that thought, that the hail of munition landed around us. I heard the rising screams from all directions, and once again spotted the rambling horde of pure strains. Jurgen sent a melter blast down the corridor, but it barely slowed them. For every one that fell, there seemed to be an army in reserve. Abruptly, Trebek took a bolt to the chest, the explosive tip bursting through her ribcage, splattering the wall next to her with viscera. She just had enough time to look surprised before the light faded from her eyes. Every gun we had barked into the wall of death. "Commissar!" Ambly's voice was suddenly in my vox bead. "Tell Jurgen to shoot the wall, about 3 meters back from the current position. Hurry!" To his credit, Jurgen complied as quickly. "This way!" I shouted, Ambly and I stepping over the rubble. As we passed the threshold, to my horror, the hole collapsed, as rubble from above poured onto it. I scrambled, trying to shift the stone. "Leave it, Ciaphas." Ambly shook her head regretfully. "They're past helping now." I stood, slowly, brushing the dust from my clothes, and wondered how I was ever going to manage without Jurgen. 13 years was a long time to serve together after all. I didn't know how many times he had saved my life. The only person I trusted. The sense of loss was numbing, and quite unexpected. We walked mostly in silence for the next hours, only putting together the pieces behind the conspiracy. We became frustrated, even snapping at each other. Such was the tension we had experienced for nearly a whole day. It was so absurd, everything we had been through, that I started to chuckle, growing into a full belly laugh. It infected her too. The throaty chuckle I'd found so appealing before erupted from her chest like magma. After that, there was no stopping either of us, and we simply held each other up until we could finally force the air to remain in our aching ribs. Our laughter faded as we once again pressed on, until we approached what looked to be a lumen. We found access to a hatch that led directly to the surface. As we climbed further up, we started to recognize the architecture. We were beneath the governor's palace. We crept into a chamber, spotting what looked to be more gene stealers, but donned in the palace guard uniform. Praised the Emperor, but none of them had spotted us. We moved again, making it to the shelter of a column. I was just beginning to hope that we would make it all the way to the stairs, and to whatever lay beyond, when the crack of a lasbolt against stonework close to my head told me we'd been spotted. We drew our weapons and prepared for the oncoming rush. I took one in the head as Amberly pierced another through the chest. Suddenly an explosion rocked their ranks. I glanced upwards, expecting I knew not what. Perhaps the Emperor himself, since only divine intervention looked like saving us now. What I saw was almost as unexpected. The familiar shambling form of Jurgen, even grubbier than usual, lobbing frag grenades as Sorel levelled his rifle and began picking them off. A small explosion of joy and relief shook my chest. Amberly and I rushed into their falling numbers. I raised my chainsword and cut down two, when I heard the footsteps growing behind me. I turned and swung, coming face to face with the creature from my worst nightmares. It was grotesque, a bloated parody of a gene stealer, and the whipping blade bit deep into its arm, which would have surely ripped off my head. It howled then, in anger and pain, and I was desperately fighting for my life. "It's the Patriarch!" Amberly yelled.
Hold on, Commissar!
Jurgen was running down the stairs, his melter readied, and I prayed to the Emperor he wasn't going to try a shot from there, as I'd never survive it. But he had had more sense than that, at least.
Sorrel, clear a path for Jurgen.
Amberly called. The two of them began to concentrate their fire on the cultists between my aid and the desperate battle I still fought. I sprang back a fraction too late, and felt talons scrape my ribs, ripping through the armor beneath my coat and burning like fire. I swore, and struck back at the thing, taking the hand which had wounded me off at the wrist. I-Corp hung from it like a fire hose, spraying me and everything else in the vicinity, and if anything, it redoubled its efforts. I turned my head reflexively, trying to keep my eyes clear, and thus got a clear view of Jurgen as he raced across the floor towards me. For a heart-stopping instant, I thought a couple of pure strains were about to eviscerate him, but for some reason they hesitated for a fraction of a second, as they were about to close, and Sorel and Amberly dropped them both with well-aimed shots in the nick of time. I turned back to the Patriarch, encouraged by my success in wounding it, and swung the chainsword again. It never even flinched, batting the humming blade aside, and I ducked a wild swing of its lower left arm.
What does it take to kill you, you bastard?
I snarled, carried away by my own anger and disgust.
How about this?
Jurgen asked, appearing at my elbow. As he approached the creature, it staggered back, like the pure strains had done, momentarily disorientated, and he jammed the barrel of the melter into the wound I'd cut into its belly. As he pulled the trigger, the entire midsection flashed into steam, and foul-smelling offal. It staggered back, its eyes glazing, and swung its head in confusion. Then, slowly, it toppled over, vibrating the stone floor with the violent impact of its fall.
Thank you, Jurgen. Much obliged.
Don't mention it, sir,
he said, turning the weapon to seek other targets. But the cultists were scattering back into the shadows. For the first time, some of them gave voice, a keening wail that sent shivers down my spine. We sent a few shots after them, but I, for one, had had my fill of combat for the time being, and was more than happy to leave them to the follow-up teams. Without the Patriarch to focus and direct them, they would be easy to pick off, but they would have to be eradicated eventually. Otherwise, one of the surviving pure strains would grow to take its place, and the whole vile cancer would start to take root again.
I thought you were dead.
Jurgen nodded.
So did I, to be honest. They were almost on us when the wall collapsed. Then I thought it might just be as thin on the other side, so I took a shot at it on the off chance.
I take it you were right.
Lucky that. What about the others?
Amberly asked, as we began to climb the stairs. Jurgen looked somber.
Sorrel made it through with me. We didn't see what happened to anyone else.
But then he didn't have to. They would have been overwhelmed in seconds.
Lucky you found us when you did.
Not really.
Sorrel had come to join us as we reached the level of the gallery.
We found your tracks in the dust and just followed along.
How did you know it was us?
Amberly asked. The marksman shrugged.
One pair of Imperial Guard boots, one pair of ladies' shoes. Didn't need an Inquisitor to work that one out.
I suppose not.
She looked at him with something like respect.
Once we heard shooting, we just moved to flank the position.
Jurgen added.
Standard operating procedure. I see.
She nodded, and pointed to the solid wooden door we'd reached at the top of the staircase.
Jurgen, if you'd be so kind. My pleasure, miss.
He grinned, like a scholar student picked out to answer a question he knows the answer to, and vaporized it with a single blast from the melter, along with a generous section of wall.
Emperor's teeth.
I breathed, as we entered the passageway beyond. It was panelled in burnished wood, a thick carpet on the floor, and delicate porcelain stood on occasional tableaus of unmistakable antiquity. Bright afternoon sun stabbed our eyes through the mullioned windows, and a dreadful suspicion began to form in my mind.
I think I know where we are,
I said. Amberly nodded, her jaw set.
Me too,
she said grimly. The silence was shattered by the bark of a bolt pistol, and Sorrel fell, chunks of his brain spattering an expensive-looking tapestry and staining it beyond repair.
Commissar Cain and the charming Miss Vale.
Governor Grice was standing at the end of the corridor, gun held firmly in his hand, the air of vapid imbecility now totally dispelled.
You really are most annoyingly persistent.
The bolt exploded against the oversized helmet protecting Jurgen's head, flinging him backwards in a shower of scattered carapace. You're one of them, Amberly stated flatly, as though this merely confirmed her suspicions. She took another step towards him, and Grice shifted his aim to cover her. I watched, with some trepidation, despite knowing Amberly had an emergency displacer field. The brood will survive. A new patriarch will rise. But not in your lifetime, I said, swiveling the hellgun under Jurgen's pungently damp armpit, and squeezing the trigger. The supercharged las blast screamed through the air between us, blasting a smoky crater through the left side of the governor's chest. Thick plates of chitin were visible beneath the ruin of his robes now, and a third deformed arm emerged in the rent in the garment. Through my nausea, a sudden shot of understanding lit up my synapses. You were the assassin, I gasped. Grice raised his pistol at me, I was sure the kill shot was coming, but then he remembered Amberly, and swiveled to her as she dove for her pistol. He fired. Only to his utter shock, Amberly vanished into thin air. He turned, following the sound of Amberly's landing, just in time to see her roll to her feet, with the dexterousness of an accomplished martial artist. "Consider yourself relieved of your position," she said, pointing an accusing finger at him like a scholar tutor admonishing an unsatisfactory student. A bright flash sparked from a ring on her finger. Grice paled over, writhing from what I assume was about the worst bloody toxin in the galaxy. The estate's doors burst open. "Stand up, slowly," a familiar voice barked, then took on a tinge of astonishment. "Commissar? Is that you?" Castine looked at me for a long, searching moment, before taking in the disheveled state of the Inquisitor. Then her gaze moved on and down to the prostrate figures of Jurgen and the Governor. I indicated my aid. "He needs a medic," I said. Then for some reason, my legs gave way beneath me. I, Amberly and Jurgen rested, as Castine briefed us on the situation, of the battle above ground, and the now sweeping Imperial and Tau forces mopping up the traitorous PDF. It was a little vengeance to all the pain Grice and his coven had inflicted upon Gravelax. Gene stealers. All of them, I told Castine. "They found some survivors," came a shout. Castine hurried off, to where a small knot of figures was emerging from the wreckage of the palace. Amberly and I exchanged glances. Valade and Hollenby, each supported by a trooper with an arm around their shoulders, holding hands like a pair of courting teenagers. Apparently, Lieutenant Sulla's team had found them wandering out of the tunnels. "Valade?" I asked gently. She turned her head towards me, her eyes unfocused. She looked ill. "What happened?" "Sir?" Her brow furrowed. "They were everywhere." Hollenby cut in, his voice distant. "I see," I said, nodding slowly, and glanced across at Amberly. The same doubt was clouding her eyes, I could see. I turned back to the bedrabbled troopers, then brought up my las pistol and shot them both through the head before either of them had a chance to react. "What the hell?" Castine shouted. For a moment, I was horribly unsure of myself, afraid I'd made a terrible mistake. Then I glanced again at Amberly for reassurance. I stepped forward, cutting a hole to reveal an existing wound on both corpses. "What the hell is that?" Castine asked, over the sound of Sulla being violently sick. "A gene implant," Amberly explained. "Once it takes root in a host, it gradually subverts their own genetic identity, turning any offspring into hybrids. For the next week, the Valhallan 597th had the glorious task of putting the last of the gene stealers to the sword. The Tau themselves had begun their evacuation of Gravelax, apparently coming to the conclusion that the backwater was not worth the expense in their greater good. With Jurgen recovering, I did little else apart from eat, sleep, and shuffle data slates. I finally joined Amberly for a drink. She was apparently eager to check up on Jurgen. According to her, Jurgen was rare. He was a blank. Blanks are like anti-psychers, she'd explained. They can't be affected by psychers or warp entities. They block telepathic communication. You saw how the Patriarch reacted to him. I recalled then the peculiar moments of mine and Jurgen's life that now seemed to make sense. Apparently she knew the first time she saw him, due to her retinue psycher's reaction. "You're going to recruit him, aren't you?" I said. "If he can face down demons and sorcerers, you're not going to leave him buried in an obscure Imperial Guard unit." She smiled. Apparently not. Such was his rarity that if Jurgen's status became common knowledge, the politics of the Inquisition would become sticky. We toasted to our somewhat victory. Amberly grinned at me again. "Here's to the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Not to mention half a lifetime of running, shooting, and bowel-clenching terror. But looking back, I have to say she made it well worth the effort."
Editorial note. This, the second extract from the Cain archive, which I have prepared and annotated for those of my fellow Inquisitors who may care to peruse it, is in much the same format as the first. The astute among you will realize that it follows my previous selection, Cain's account of the Gravelax incident, Quite closely chronologically, although with his usual disregard for such niceties, it was actually recorded at an earlier point in the archive itself. I have chosen this section of his memoirs not only because it is relatively self-contained, requiring little background knowledge of his earlier exploits to appreciate, but also because the records of the Ordo Xenos contain quite a bit of detail about the events on Simia Orichalcae that year, and anyone with cause to consult them is certain to find the only complete eyewitness account of considerable interest. Not least because it confirms the suspicions many of us have long harboured about the part played by certain members of the Adeptus Mechanicus in the affair, which may be useful in future dealings with them. It may be argued that Cain is not the most reliable chronicler of events, but I am inclined to accept his version of events as absolutely true. Here, as throughout the whole archive, he rarely gives himself credit for what, to any unbiased observer, appears to be acts of genuine courage and resourcefulness, however few and far between. As before, I have been largely content to let Cain tell his story in his own words.
The ice world of Simia Orichalcae. Beautiful, isn't it? Brocklor said, his grey eyes fixed on the main hololith display. Being ice worlders themselves, of course, the Valhallans were overjoyed to hear we were being sent to Simia Orichalcae. Even before we made orbit, the viewing ports were crowded with the off-duty troopers, eager for a first sight of our new home for the next few months. As a chatter of excited voices had followed Castine, Brocklor and myself through the corridors towards the bridge. My enthusiasm, needless to say, was rather more muted. I'd been serving with the Valhallan 597 for a little over a year by that point, and had managed to settle into a fairly comfortable routine. I got on well with both Colonel Castine and her second-in-command, Major Brocklor. They appeared to consider me as much of a friend as it was possible to be with a regimental commissar. The Valhallan 597th was by now a well-oiled machine, but I was beginning to see why the vast majority of regiments in the Imperial Guard were segregated by gender. Lovers' trysts and relationship drama were certainly not what I had prepared for in the commissariat, though spirits and discipline were now high for the prospect of fighting in the conditions so similar to their homeworld. I could sense their impatience to get down there and feel the permafrost beneath their boot soles. Like bacteria under a microscope, we zoomed in on the orc mass that threatened the Mechanicus facility we had been ordered to defend. It was cutting it fine, but we could have the regiment down at least a day before the vanguard smashes against the Cogboy's precious refinery. The ship captain's own tech priest handed us a data slate. The discomfort we all felt was apparent, but seemingly unnoticed by the tech priest. Or if she did, she said nothing. I headed towards the first shuttle. My overblown heroic reputation had to be maintained, and a likely uncontested landing would just about do it. In this I had a valuable ally, my aide Jurgen, who had an almost preternatural talent for scrounging, which had made my life considerably more comfortable than it might otherwise have been in our decade and a half together. He dropped into the seat next to me, preceded as always by his spectacular body odour. The most important part of Jurgen was his complete lack of imagination, which he more than made up for with his dogged defence to authority and an unquestioning acceptance of whatever orders. Having someone like this as a buffer between me and the mundane task amounted to a gift from the Emperor. Add that to the innumerable perils we'd faced and bested together, I can honestly say that he was the only person I ever fully trusted, apart from myself. I almost groaned out loud as Lieutenant Sulla and her platoon loaded onto our transport. We were stuffed to the brim with Valhallans in their thick coats as our shuttle departed. As we dove into the atmosphere of Simia Orichalcae, I peered over to Jurgen. The poor man suffered from motion sickness and was desperate to be on solid ground again, and perhaps sooner than expected. The shuttle began to rock. We were taking fire. "Nothing to worry about," I said, almost amused. "That's small arms fire. The chances of anything actually hitting us at this range are astronomical. One day I'm going to learn to stop saying things like that." No sooner had the words left my mouth than the shuttle shuddered even more violently than before, and pitched sharply to port. Red icons began to appear on data slates, and the servitor began punching controls with greater speed and abhuman dexterity. Pressure lost in number 2 engine, it chanted. Combustion efficiency dropping by 16%. What's going on? Sulla asked as I buckled in, tense for the impact. The greenskins put a dent in us. There's going to be a bump, I said. I felt strangely calm. There was nothing I could do now except trust in the Emperor. A violent impact jarred my spine into the roof of my skull, driving my breath from my lungs. I felt the screaming vibrations ripple through my body as the transport glided hard upon the rock and ice. We grounded to a halt and staggered out. I turned to Sulla, who was trying to stem a nosebleed. For that matter, I suppose we all looked a bit worse for wear, except possibly Jurgen. As with him, it was hard to tell. We dragged our wounded from the wreckage, and I had the unfortunate task of the pilot, who after saving our lives, threw up on my boots. The blistering cold winds of Sima Orichalci smacked me like a punch. My damn nose was so frozen that the stink of Jurgen had seemed to disappear. Lucky for us, we had crashed not too far from the facility. Unlucky for us, there was a bone-chilling cold and roaming orcs. Rather than freezing my gonads off, I suggested we start making a move. Orcs, Sulla shouted. Rather unnecessarily under the circumstances, I thought. I whirled around to look in the direction she was pointing. She was right, except it was a handful charging an entire platoon worth of rifles. It suddenly hit me. I was the only human they could see. The Valhallans' camouflage uniforms were blending them into the snowscape, and with my commissars black and scarlet making me stand out like an Ogrin in a beauty pageant, they hadn't bothered looking for anyone else. I breathed a silent thanks to the Emperor. Ceasefire, I snapped, seeing the opportunity for a perfect ambush. Let's draw them in. Far better to cut them down at short range than engage at distance, where we would run the risk of a survivor or two escaping to report our arrival back to the war boss. It was a good idea, until I realized the only one in danger was me. I dropped suddenly, with a dramatically outflung arm and a theatrical scream. It was a performance which wouldn't have even fooled a 5-year-old, but I heard a whoop of triumph from the leading orc. As they got closer, I was able to hear enough. Together they were arguing about who would get the credit for killing me. Their crude weapons and clothes, likely strung together with more hope than engineering, rattled louder, as finally they were within range, so I ordered to fire at will. So those were orcs, Sulla said. They don't look so tough. I bit my lip. She might as well feel confident for as long as possible. But I knew from bitter experience that when the main force got here the next day, it would be a different story. I, Jurgen, and Sulla's platform trudged until we finally reached the black, smoke-billowing spires of the Mechanicus facility. Castine welcomed me up to the conference room in the heart of the refinery. Scriver Quintus, one of the administratum, stepped forward to welcome us. He was a youngish man, with thinning blonde hair and a pasty complexion. Thank you, Castine smiled warmly. Colonel Castine, Valhallan 597th. This is our regimental commissar, Ciaphas Cain. An honor, I said. I've seen your statue in Liberation Square on Telethon. I must say it doesn't really do you justice, he said. That'll be the pigeon droppings, I said dryly. Tends to erode my natural dignity. He laughed, and I decided I liked him. He informed us of the ongoing problem, the one about the amassing army in the mountains, but also deep beneath the facility. 5 of the miners had gone missing over a period of weeks. Leader Morel's miners were the ones dragging up the raw materials for the Mechanicus, and apparently he was more than flummoxed by the waving of his concerns by the tech priests. And then it was almost like the man wouldn't stop babbling on. The highest ranking administratum adept, a white-haired woman called Pryke, called the meeting to order with every sign of enthusiasm. Fortunately, Castine had a much lower level tolerance for idiots than I did, so it was with some relief that I saw her stand to interrupt the aging bureaucrat mid-flow. Thank you for your input, she said crisply. It is clear that you all have particular insights to offer, which we will be calling upon and when we see the need, she said. May I suggest you provide us with daily reports, Pryke said. You may not. Castine bit back. We are here to fight a war, not push files around. There was an edge to Castine's voice, now which every officer in the regiment had learned to be wary of. Pryke bristled. This facility now is under martial law, I added, and I have to admit the result was hugely enjoyable. Pryke went scarlet, then white, then scarlet again. By this time tomorrow, all you'll see out there is orcs, Castine continued. We are your only hope of not ending up dead or worse, so shut up, keep out of our way, and let us do our job. This is unacceptable, Pryke said, her voice tight with outrage. Live with it, Castine said, unless you prefer the alternative. I most certainly do, Pryke glared at us both. Fine, I said. I drew my las pistol and dropped it on the table from just the right height to produce a nice resonant thud. Under the powers bestowed upon me by the Commissariat in the name of His Divine Majesty, I serve notice that any civilian obstructing his forces in the defense of his realm will be subject to summary execution under Article 17 of the Rules of Military Justice. I raised an interrogative eyebrow at Pryke. You were saying? I added, and much to my chagrin, the meeting was cut rather short.
Sieur Morel, I'd like a quick word with you, if you can spare the time.
I judged my movement precisely, so that to the casual observer it looked as though we'd reached the door of the conference room together purely by chance. The grizzled miner turned in my direction, assessed the situation with keen intelligence, and nodded. Dismissing his staff with a casual wave, they filed out along with the tech priests and quill pushers, Ernulf and Pryke, still simmering nicely, leaving us alone with Castine and Brocklaw. The Major had joined the conference shortly after Castine dropped her little bombshell, talking over the tactical briefings of the refinery staff. Now the two of them were huddled over data slates refining their strategy for the defense of the planet. Ernulf, Pike, and their respective hangers-on had turned out to be quite helpful after the sight of my sidearm, and had cleared the air, no doubt reflecting that the orcs might very well get to them if they didn't do all they could to help. And if the greenies didn't, I most certainly would. A handful of troopers were bustling in and out of the conference suite, setting up maps, boards, and large urns of tanner leaf tea. It looked as though this was going to be our command post, at least for the time being. Castine claimed it was an excellent vantage point from which to direct the troops, but I suspected she just liked the view from the window. I found the gradual transformation from civilian decadence to the purposeful military atmosphere quite reassuring. How the miner viewed it, I had no idea or interest to come to that.
Of course. How can I help?
Morel asked. I poured myself a bowl of tanner tea and offered him one. After a moment he took it, sipped cautiously and appeared to approve, although the Valhallan brew isn't to everyone's taste.
Earlier you mentioned some of your miners had disappeared in mysterious circumstances. Would you care to elaborate?
An expression of mild surprise crossed his grizzled features. I suppose that after being stonewalled by the other factions here for so long, our interest was unexpected.
5 people, in just over a month.
He shrugged.
It might not sound much out of a workforce of 600, but believe me, it matters to us. Of course, the Administratum and the Mechanicus don't give a damn. Just trot out the same old line about the losses being within acceptable statistical parameters.
What's your opinion?
I asked. Morel sipped his tea, formulating a response, and I forestalled him.
I want your gut reaction. Don't feel you have to be polite.
He laughed and looked at me with renewed respect.
Just as well. Diplomacy isn't exactly my strong point.
He sipped again.
Some things definitely wrong down there. Don't ask me what, though.
Then we need to find out,
I said. Castine broke off our conversation with Brocklaw long enough to nod. Brocklaw nodded too.
Absolutely. No point in fortifying the place if the trouble's already inside with us.
You think we've got orcs in the tunnels?
Morel paled at the thought. Whatever he'd thought the problem might be, this clearly wasn't it.
It's possible. Although sneaking around picking people off one at a time isn't exactly their style.
And I don't see how they could have got here that soon,
Castine added, with a glance at the hemisphere map pinned to the wall close to her seat.
It's taken them over 6 weeks to get here from the crash site. If an advance party was taking your miners, they'd have had to have got halfway around the planet within a few days of their arrival. And we've seen no sign of any rapid deployment capability.
Unless they teleported,
I suggested.
It has been known.
We're not jumping to conclusions, are we?
Brocklaw mused.
Could it just be an unfortunate series of accidents, after all?
That hardly seems likely.
Morel stared at the plan on the opposite wall. The strangling and meandering lines looked nothing so much as a detailed diagram of a plate full of noodles. where the precious veins of ice which could be transmuted into promethium have been hauled out for countless generations.
Can you show us where the missing miners vanished from?
I asked. Morel nodded, picking up a stylus from the desk, and marked the points in rapidly. I realized he must have done this before, no doubt hoping to find some connection himself. I stared at the rumpled sheet of paper, translating the lines into my mind into a three-dimensional image, and trying to get a feel for the space. If there was to be a pattern discerned, however, it eluded me.
Have you spotted something?
Castine asked hopefully, aware of my tunnel rat instincts from my report on the Gravelax incident. I shook my head.
There's no obvious connection between these points,
I said. I tapped one with a fingernail.
This gallery is a dead end, for instance. An assailant would have to get past an entire shift of workers unobserved.
And that's just not possible,
Morel confirmed, which begged another question that Brockwell was obliging enough to ask.
Unless one of the refinery staff is responsible.
He began, but trailed off as Morel's face darkened.
If you're planning to accuse any of my people of murder, you'd better have some damn good evidence.
No one's accusing anyone of anything,
I soothed, bringing back the unspoken yet.
You've brought a potentially serious security breach to our attention. We're trying to get to the bottom of it, that's all.
If it saves any more of my people, I'm glad to help,
the miner said, somewhat mollified.
I'm glad to hear it.
I gazed at the map of the mine's workings again, as though deep in thought.
But I don't think we'll solve the problem talking about it over a bowl of tea.
Then what do you suggest?
Castine asked. I sighed with every appearance of reluctance and shook my head.
I'll just have to go down there and take a look around,
I said. Now, if you've been reading my memoirs with any degree of attention, it's probably struck you that this apparent willingness to put myself in harm's way is somewhat uncharacteristic, to say the least. But try to see things from my point of view. For one thing, if I hung around here while the defenses were being prepared, there was a pretty good chance I'd end up in that bone-chilling cold again. And I was most reluctant not to do so. Not to mention the fact there was a horde of greenskins on their way. I've seen some sights in my time, and it takes a lot to impress me. But I have to admit that even today, after more than a century, the ice caves of Sima or Calce stand out in my memory as a sight to behold. The walls glittered, every single irregularity in the surface reflecting and refracting beams of light. Sergeant Lustig, a man who upon Gravelax had shown me nothing but competency, led our small squad deeper. We had by now long passed the layers of metallic facility, past the throngs of miners down into the dark and rock-hard ice caverns. Penlin here. The voice of one of the troopers hissed in my comm-bead. I've got something. Looks like tracks. We saw Trooper Penlin backlit by the illuminator she taped to the barrel of her lasgun. Jurgen trotted at my heels, his own weapon leveled and ready for use. Experience had taught us both you can never be too cautious in circumstances like this. They looked like a bit of Genestealer tracks, Jurgen said uncertainly. He was partly right. They'd been gouged out by what looked like powerful talons, but the spacing was all wrong to be the work of a stealer. Or Nids, maybe? I don't think so, I said. I felt the crunch disappear from my steps, as now we trod in the smooth ice, likely never witnessed by mankind. It was warmer down here compared to the blistering surface, yet still my breath puffed out before me. The trooper on point, Penlin I think, began communicating by hand signals wherever possible, and resorted to the comnet only when absolutely necessary. Almost without thought we slipped into the assumption that we were now in hostile territory. We reached now what appeared to be a dead end, but the chances of whatever had left those tracks staying behind to be bottled up by our advance were remote. But still my mouth went dry, my stomach cramping with the anticipation of combat, my imagination running wild with the images of rampant chaos spawn. We halted. I used my lumen to scan around the room, tracing a small crack from the ceiling, too near where Penlin stood. A faint, but ominous cracking sound echoed in the chamber. Penlin! Lustig started forward, until I restrained him with an arm across the chest. The chamber began to shake, and Penlin disappeared into the dark. There was no knowing how far the treacherous dreadfall extended. Penlin, report! Static hissed in our comm-beats. What's the first step, Sarge? Her voice sounded winded. but if she could crack jokes, she couldn't be that badly hurt. It's steeper than it looks. Better move carefully, I counselled the sergeant, no telling how unstable the rest of the floor is. I inched forward cautiously. From here I could see that a thin crust of ice had formed across the gap, where the roof fall had breached the ceiling of a chamber below us. A chamber, I suddenly realised, which didn't appear anywhere on the map. That's frozen over recently, Jurgen said, with the certainty of an ice worlder. We peered over the edge and saw Penland. Sit tight. Lustig appeared at my elbow, a coil of climbing rope in his hands. He threw it down as she began to climb, only to freeze suddenly. Sarge, there's something down here. I can hear movement, she said. After a second or so, I heard it too. The scrape of a claw against ice, moving fast, and the loud panting of a predator which had caught a fresh scent. I joined Lustig, grabbing the rope and hauled. Get her up, I shouted. I put my hand out as she grabbed it, when something seized the dangling rope below her and jerked it hard. Penland fell, along with me. I was swallowed by the dark and landed hard on ice. I was reeling, but had just enough wit to dive for Penland's las rifle. I had a brief, panic-stricken image of claws and jaws too large and terrifying to be real. I raised the rifle as fast as I could move, and unleashed a full clip into the blur of death. The creature screamed and fled. It was hours later that I, Jurgen, Lustig, Penland and the squad returned to the conference room. And you don't have a clue of what it is? Brocklaw asked. None, but you wouldn't want it as a house pet, believe me. A few of those present in the command center chuckled dutifully. Alongside a strange creature, a new tunnel and the frozen remains of the miners, we had a large issue. We had a weak point in the heart of the facility. Before the administratum, Miner Morel and the tech priests, Castine had been holding the fort. Just outside I could see it. The Orc horde had arrived just on time, and were now throwing their fodder against our outer defences. The 597th would relish this part, but I knew it would get worse. It's why the evacuation of the civilian population kept pace. Morel broke in. The question is, what are we going to do about it? It was easy, I thought. Go back down there and kill it, I said. Morel nodded with grim satisfaction. A small justice for his miners. It was extremely vital that the Orcs didn't discover these tunnels of the creatures burrowing underneath us, lest we have a war on two fronts. And if the process kept me away from the worst of the fighting and cementing my reputation, I volunteered for the hunt. I would like to come too, if I may, said Logash, one of the tech adepts. I think I'm hardly exaggerating when I say the rest of us simply stared at him in blank astonishment. Genealogy is a bit of a hobby of mine. I might be able to identify what we are looking for, he said. This is a search and destroy mission, not a stroll around the zoo, Castine said irritably. Logash looked a little crestfallen. I thought she was being unnecessarily hard on the boy. It would be at your own risk, I told him. And you'll be under military authority. That means you do what you're told at all times, alright? Fine. He nodded eagerly. Do I get a gun? Absolutely not, Castine and I said simultaneously. Before I departed, Castine and Brocklaw pulled me aside. Conferring with the wide auspex of our ship above the planet, I saw a blip that made my heart drop. According to this, it's huge, Castine said, a hint of confusion in her voice. But I knew what it was. A gargant. Castine and Brocklaw stared at one another in horror. The orcish equivalent of a battle titan. The approaching construct might be crude, but it would certainly have enough firepower aboard to punch through our defense. We descended back into the tunnels. Did you remember the marshmallows this time? I asked Jurgen, echoing Amberly's jest when she caught sight of the melter he was carrying on Gravelax. He smiled sheepishly. No problem. We'll just have to find something else for you to toast, I said. I'm not sure that would be wise, Logash said, hurrying to join us, and looking somewhat askance at the heavy thermal weapon. That would pretty much vaporize the creature. Then we might never know what it was. That's a disappointment I could learn to live with, I said, then took pity on his crestfallen expression. Led by the newly promoted Sergeant Gryphon, who only I could tell was nervous, I, Jurgen, Logash, Voorhees, Hale, Simla, Dreer and Katra peered down the hole Penland and I fell down earlier. Are there any tracks? Logash asked eagerly. Gryphon looked at him with an air of vague surprise, as though it slipped her mind for a moment that we were being accompanied by a civilian. I could tell that Logash's Xenos fascination was going to be very tiresome. We climbed down the opening and began to tread down the clearly burrowed tunnel. Thank the Emperor for my highest sense of direction and depth. As more tunnel opened and meandered, I kept a mental sense of direction. Logash seemed to be more excited by the markings on the walls as we got deeper. Just then the palm of my hand started tingling, in the way they do when my subconscious warns me of something my forebrain has yet to grasp. I stopped as I felt a tremor. I looked back and forth down the tunnel, craning my neck to see as best as I could, past the troopers on either side of me. The light from our lumens receded in both directions, still striking dazzling highlights from the deep blue surface of the ice around us. "Something's coming," I said. Both point and rear guard saw nothing. Sudden understanding punched me in the gut. The creature we were hunting was a burrower. "Jürgen!" I shouted. "Give us some elbow room." Divining my intentions, the troopers nearest to us scattered back along the passageway. Logash was hauled away, protesting by Gryphon, who couldn't be bothered trying to explain. Jürgen let out a hissing blast of melter into the wall, filling the chamber with obscuring mist. He was just in time, too. An instant later, the frozen wall burst in on us, in a hail of glittering ice shards. The living nightmare I'd encountered before was among us, and by sheer foul luck, I was the closest to it. I drew my chainsword and smashed against a rending claw. I was too close to the beast for the others to take a shot, and had I been any other commissar, perhaps they would have. The beast snarled as I pushed free and dove beneath it. I swung the humming blade at its thorax, feeling the teeth bite home, and was rewarded with a spray of ichor and foul-smelling viscera. It screamed again, opening the mandals impossibly wide, and bringing its head down to snap me. That was precisely what I had been hoping for. The tactic worked well on some of the larger tyrannid bioforms, so I was ready and waiting, thrusting the tip of my trusty chainsword up through the open maw. I stood back as the corpse of the creature slumped forward, the group staring at me in amazement. Lucky they couldn't see the panic I was feeling, as once again something had reinforced my heroic reputation. "There's your specimen," I told Logash, returning my trusty chainsword to its scabbard. "Do you think you can identify it?" "It's an amble," he said, shaking his head in bafflement. "They are all desert dwellers." Clearly not native then. But then came the worst part. There was never one. They had a nest. "Any idea of how many more of those things are down here?" I whispered, hoping the others wouldn't hear. "No more than half a dozen," Logash muttered. I think it dawned upon him now that he was unarmed. Whether he still had enough meat on him to actually interest any amble was a moot point, of course. Fire sounds barked behind us. We rushed to the point guard, seeing a corpse. It was surrounded by chattering troopers, and riddled with the cauterized craters of lasbolt impacts. Voorhees was breathing heavily. "Well done," I said, clapping him on the back. It never hurt to show the troopers I cared, even if I didn't. He grinned at me weakly. "Persistent little frackers, aren't they, sir?" I asked Voorhees the direction from which it came. He pointed down one of the adjoining tunnels. I absently noted that it was almost directly towards the orc siege lines. A sense of grim foreboding settled across my shoulders. If it was returning to the lair, it would have been carrying prey of some kind to share with the others. Logash chipped in helpfully. The pool of light from our illuminators revealed nothing, apart from the dismembered amble. There was an answer. We weren't going to be able to complete our reconnaissance mission without passing through a cavern full of these monstrosities. But brow-clenching as the prospect appeared, I liked the idea of a horde of orcs pouring through these tunnels to slaughter the lot of us even less. "Close up," I ordered. "Be ready to concentrate your firepower." We moved out cautiously, heading towards the center of the maze, our sensors alert for any sign of movement in the darkness. We debated dousing a few of our illuminators, but according to Logash it wouldn't make a difference, as the creatures couldn't see in the dark anyway. Again, hours of silence, where we pushed our hearing to the limit. The temperatures so deep in these solid dark blue caverns had stabilized to just freezing, which was a little comfort. A lasgun opened up, bright muzzle flashes strobing down the reflective tunnel. Our middle group broke into a run to the point guard. "Jenny!" Voorhees shouted, and a second weapon opened up in support. A moment later there was a shriek. which echoed through the tunnels, raising the hairs on my arms, and a howl of feedback through the combi which made my teeth ache. Deary was down, streaming blood starting to freeze in a slick, hard plate, over a gaping wound in her torso. Her face was pinched and white from the shock. Voorhees stood over her, pouring lasfire into the monstrosity, which had evidently inflicted the damage, driving it back, screaming in rage and frustration. Our squad opened up, as lasballs lit the chamber like a flashing strobe. "Over there! 8 o'clock!" Jurgen swung his hand in a familiar gesture, lobbing a frag grenade over the heads of the nearest monsters to burst amongst the ones clustered at the back. Human limbs flew in front of me, as I drew my chainsword, slashing its teeth across one's face. But just as quick as it started, it ended in hard silence. "Casualties?" I asked, playing up to my caring image. Gryphon made a rapid assessment. "Too serious. A few cuts and bruises amongst the rest, but they'll live." Voorhees was treating Deary. The determination in his eyes told me there was more to their relationship. I hated hard choices like this. We had no evidence of orc presence, and had likely killed enough ambles, but I wasn't certain, and we didn't have confirmation that this weakness was patched up. Plus, there was the other risk. The certainty of safety, or the potential loss of my carefully nurtured image as a leader who cared about the troopers he serves with. The illusion that I was one of them had saved my life many times, as they repaid the loyalty they believed I held for them. It was Jurgen and Logash who broke the deadlock in my vacillating mind, leading us to the ambled nest just at the side. We found evidence of more lost miners, and, to my disappointment, an orc skull. So I had my answer. Whether or not the greenskins were aware of it, there was a way down into this labyrinth somewhere beyond their lines, and any other choice I might have made was now moot. I turned back to Gryphon. "We go on," I said. I made a big show of consulting Logash, where everyone could hear me, confirming with him that we were unlikely to find more ambles, which means we can safely divide our forces, I said, as I had expected a flicker of interest pass around the faces surrounding me. Second team would head back with the wounded, and thus if they passed on the way, my reputation was intact. A win-win. I had to hold back when Logash excitedly announced he would continue with us. The cogboy had been nothing but a curious child so far, but I figured his auspex would be useful. Despite my confidence that we were alone down here, we moved out in full combat order. Despite everyone's unspoken apprehension, we encountered no more ambles, which came as an immense relief, believe you me, and the only footfalls we heard were our own. After an hour, Logash popped up beside me. "We are below the ice layer now, actually down in the bedrock of the planet. Quite fascinating," he said. "I'm glad you're finding the trip so entertaining," I said. But the tech priest was almost impervious to sarcasm as Jurgen, and nodded in response. "Not quite the words I'd choose, but it certainly beats recalibrating the interocitors," I think he said cheerfully. I had no idea what he meant, of course, so I smiled and suggested we get moving again. To my surprise, it was Jurgen who kept in conversation with Logash. It was then I overheard them. "So, what you're saying," Jurgen said slowly, "is that these mountains are like a very large carrot." I kept my face straight with an effort, although a strangled snort escaped from Margaret, who was behind me. We followed the ice tunnel for hours, until strangely the walls changed, from circular and irregular to angled and square. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I began to recognize obsidian architecture in front of us, finely polished stone of absolute blackness, seeming somehow to suck in the light into itself, all the darker and more forbidding for the faint reflective sheen which coated it. "Omnissiah preserve us," Logash breathed at my elbow, and for a moment I thought he'd recognized it too. "Everyone out," I commanded. "Break out the demo charges and prepare to seal this now." "Commissar?" Gryphon looked a little confused. The last thing on my mind was how I appeared to the other ranks. "There are worse things than greenskins," I said. The Valhallans probably would have no idea what I meant when I uttered the word Necrons. "But you can't blow up a discovery of this magnitude." Logash was practically beside himself. "Think of the archaeotech that must be down there. Destroying it would be a crime against the Omnissiah." "Frack the Omnissiah," I said, finally shutting him up. Have you any idea what would happen if there are dormant Necrons down there, and we did something to disturb them? I'm sure your soldiers could deal with them, whatever they are. Logash replied stiffly. Well, I'm not, I said without thinking. Memories flashed in my mind, metallic skeletons, an undying numberless horde of Xenos, reaping bolts of flaying light. This changed everything. The orcs above were nothing compared to the threat that slept below. Holding the facility would be no longer possible. We had to evacuate and seal this tomb from orbit. Logash glared at me, the divergence of our thoughts evident. But as if a joke straight from the God Emperor, Silma called. We crept around, joining her, finding one of the orcs' crude shooters on the floor. Likely the piece belonging to the skull in the nest. It meant the ambles had tracked through here, meaning there was another cavern. One that the orcs could still find. And worse, awaken the Necrons. It would mean a war on two fronts by two Xenos. We had no choice but to press forward. We clung to the edge of the ominous sickly green glowing black city. We all held bated breath until we caught sight of the distinct clawed tunnel. Pushing forward, I started to rally. The dread rise got lighter and better. Smells like snow, Gryphon said cautiously. We must be getting close. I was prepared to take her word for it. After all, she knew snow and ice the way I did tunnels. Emperor's bowels, I said, pulling the scarf up over my mouth and nose, feeling sharp shards of pain skitter through my abused lungs. Somehow, incredibly, the Amble's tunnel had broken to the surface, hundreds of meters deeper than it should have been possible. But we were undeniably outside again. Conditions outside were even worse than I could have possibly imagined. The snow continued to flurry all around us, driven by a wind keener than an Eldar witch's flensing knife, and I found my eyes shutting reflexively before I was a handful of paces from the cave mouth. I inhaled Jurgen's acrid odour gratefully, as though it were a bouquet of fine vintage, mildly surprised to find that my nose was still working. Hold on, Commissar. Something settled across my face, and the stinging in my eyes abated a little. Luckily, I usually carry a spare, Jurgen said sheepishly, placing goggles across my face. To my complete lack of surprise, every trooper in first team had donned a pair as well. But, like Jurgen, these conditions were common to them. Warpish, judging by their body language, most of them were actually enjoying the hellish temperatures. Lucky for us, we only found a singular orc track, likely the one devoured by the ambles. We were set to head back, when we realised an issue. Logash was nowhere to be found. Not that I would miss the blithering idiot, but I didn't want to risk his corpse being another flare for orc activity near this opening. We pushed into the blizzard. From beyond the cave, the storm was so thick that any tracks here were long gone. My vox bead buzzed. Contact, 90 meters down the slope. I could hardly see an arm's length in front of my eyes, but Gryphon sounded confident enough. I was still trying to force my numb lips to form a reply, when Gryphon's voice cut into the net. Is it the cogboy? Negative, Margaret said, their voice tense. I could see a lot of movement down there. That could only mean one thing, of course. I was already scrambling for my las pistol, with numb and nerveless fingers, when they spoke again, confirming it. Greenies. Lots of them. Pull back, I ordered. We spotted at least 30, probably more. Too many for us to take out here, even with the Valhallans' ability to make use of the terrain, and weather conditions to mount an effective ambush. We have to secure the cave whatever happens. I must confess that the thought of getting out of the bone-numbing wind was so strong and so all-pervading that I quite lost track of my surroundings. I stumbled through the snow like an automaton, following in the tracks ploughed by Jurgen. I thought we were clear, when a bolt round shattered against a rock next to me. I turned, and with numb fingers fired 2 las bolts into an approaching shadow. The unmistakable hiss of the melter opening up behind me made me turn, just in time to see my aide cut down a small group of orcs. More sounds of gunfire barked in the distance. I strained my ears, desperate not to hear the sound of Necron Gauss flares. Maybe they've found the cogboy? Hale said slowly, clearly not relishing the idea. I nodded, sharing the same mental picture of the tech priests fleeing blindly, howling greenskins in pursuit, firing their ramshackle weapons excitedly as they ran. That seemed unpleasantly plausible. I made the difficult choice to leave Logash behind. The Necron threat had to be brought back to command. Plus it got me clear of the howling winds and greenskins. We hunkered down near the cave entrance, hoping the flow of orcs would pass us by, but my worst suspicions were confirmed, as a vivid green beam, the colour of a festering wound, ripped through the air, with the all too vividly remembered sound of tearing cloth, striking one of the orcs full on. In less than a second he seemed to dissolve, skin, muscle and skeleton whipping away to vapour, leaving only the echo of a howl of inhuman agony to mark his passing. Death incarnate emerged through the snow, as the metallic skeleton-like bodies of the Necrons made their appearance. The orcs were flayed alive, as more of the green plasmas reaped their lines, but orcs were pure rage and muscle. They didn't go down easily. The shambling horde closed the gap, despite many falling. They managed to rip apart the two Necrons, their bodies upon death fizzling into the snow. The orcs howled in triumph. Only I knew that the Necrons were simply teleporting back to their foul source. The remaining orcs were emerging from cover now, stamping about where the Necrons had vanished, and looting the bodies of their fallen companions. Guttural expressions of surprise and confusion drifted towards us on the wind. "What about the greenies?" Silma whispered. I hesitated. They weren't our most urgent priority now, and with any luck would divert any Necron attention from us, as we scuttled back through the tunnels to warn Castine and the others. But then again, they'd already found the mouth of the cave, and would be too close behind us for comfort if they felt the urge to do any exploring. "Kill them all," I ordered. A flurry of lasbolts sheared through green muscle. Greenskins slammed dead against the snow as they roared towards our position. Lund moved up, hefting his flamer and dousing a full squad of greenies, but the one in the front kept coming, charred skin and all. Lund swung the barrel, trying to line up another shot, then fell back, an expression of pain surprise on his face as a bloody crater exploded in his chest. "Jürgen!" I ordered, gesturing to the group, which was now close enough to be targets for the melter. Smiling grimly, my aide took careful aim, sighting directly at the limping leader, who was still snarling in triumph at the death of our fellow trooper. Jürgen loosed a sizzling shot, carving the beast into parts of stinking meat. Silence fell as we gathered around Lund's now freezing corpse. "He did his duty," I said, the highest praise I could think of, and everyone nodded somberly. Gryphon gestured to Hale and Silma. "Bring him," she said. "We'll take turns." I shook my head. "I wish we could," I said, as gently as I could manage, "but we don't have the time, and we have to get back as fast as possible." I half expected her to argue, but she nodded reluctantly. "We can't leave any trace of our presence here," I said somberly. I led the others in a few ritual words commending Lund's soul to the Emperor, as Jürgen's melter ignited his remains. I felt like it was the right thing to do. We pushed back into the cave, bringing our lumens back up as the darkness grew each meter we descended. We caught the sight of another side tunnel, one we had missed before. Upon closer inspections, we found the remains of an amble and several orcs. The bodies intact, except for the terrifying fact their skin had been completely flayed. Whatever did this was nothing like the orcs, amble, or Necrons I knew. "Shouldn't we see what's at the end of the tunnel?" Gryphon asked, reluctance audible in her voice. I shook my head. No. It took all the self-control I could muster to sound calm and collected, instead of screaming the word. Nothing's more important than reporting back what we've found. Besides, Maggot chipped in, indicating the mutilated orc with a casual wave. "That looks like a pretty definite keep out sign to me." "Then let's take the hint," I said. Gryphon nodded. "You'll get no arguments from me." We made to move, when we heard it from behind. The sounds of boots crunching on hoarfrost, and the guttural voices whispering in Orcish. They had found the cave. The voices grew in volume, but in a tone I was sure would passed for orc stealth. The squad scattered and clung to the walls as we prepared our ambush. To my surprise, however, they didn't charge blindly forward into combat as I'd expected. A couple of small objects flew through the gap, bouncing on the frost-covered floor, and skittering wildly in random directions. "Grenade!" Silma yelled, just before they detonated. A storm of shrapnel ripped through the air. Silma fell backwards, ugly wounds peppering their body. Hale was luckier, their partner taking most of the blast. but I could see their left arm was bleeding heavily and hung limply at their side. Hale leapt forward into the gap, screaming in anger, firing their lasgun one-handed on full auto. A volley of bolts tore Hale apart in a rain of blood and viscera. And then the orcs were among us. Silma tried to raise their lasgun as the first bounded through the narrow opening, but before they could pull the trigger, a massive cleaver swung down to bisect their skull. The greenskin bellowed in triumph, but it was short-lived. As Margaret and I shot it almost simultaneously, the chokehold was swarming with orcs, and I leapt forward with my chainsword. I gutted one, spraying blood and viscera that instantly froze on the cave walls. A surge of melter blasted past me, that scorched through a crowd of orcs, creating a plug of meat. The cave began to shake. Margaret pulled me back as ice and rock collapsed in front, sealing off the orcs and the others too far ahead. Only I, Jurgen, Gryphon and Margaret were left. I understood the pain on Gryphon's face, having lost so many. The way in front of us was sealed, alongside the greenskin advance. In time they would clear the mound, but the Necron threat was more important. We all looked to the last tunnel available to us, and shuddered. I averted my eyes from the mutilated orcs as we filed past their silent and frozen bodies, and wondered if I'd doomed us all. My tunnel rat instincts told me we were descending slowly again, ever deeper into the bowels of the planet, and the deeper we went, the closer the enshrouding gloom seemed to wrap itself around us, until the air against my face seemed thick and warm, almost choking in its closeness. A faint humming was discernible in the air now, hovering just on the edge of audibility, and a faint acrid tang tingled the membranes of my nose. All things I remembered only too well, and hoped to never experience again. We reached what felt like an entrance. I enjoyed the expression of perplexity on Gryphon and Margaret's face. Jurgen was an easy man to underestimate, until you got to know him, and few people ever bothered. He stepped forward and offered to lead the way. I tried to look calm, but I'd be surprised if I fooled any one of them for a moment. Both women looked almost sick with apprehension, and knowing what awaited us, I have no doubt my appearance was even worse. We emerged into a vast shadowy cavern, full of machinery of strange design and incomprehensible function. Vast geometric slabs rose in the gloom about us, leaking that rancid green illumination from vents and thick pipes of stuff, which looked like glass, but undoubtedly wasn't, suffusing the whole space with shadows and flat, directionless light. In the pale green glow we looked like corpses, long dead and rotting, and I found myself wondering how I ever hoped to come through this unscathed. We stalked through the shadows, where the silhouettes of skulls reflected dimly. In stasis, I breathed. There was no exaggeration to say I was utterly stricken with horror. I think we'll need bigger guns, Gryphon said dryly, wrenching her eyes away from that all but infinite legion. The plan would be to bury this tomb from orbit. That was the best we could do, at least until I informed Amberley. We froze. The moment we saw shifting, shambling Necrons moving in the distance. Their fingers ended in long, gleaming blades, smeared with a substance that looked black in this gloom light, but which I had no doubt was truly red. Most terrifying of all, their metal torsos were hidden from view. Then the realization hit me, along with a spasm of nausea. They were draped in the flayed hides of dead orcs. We moved again, passing through the forests of glowing tubes, uncannily reminiscent of plague-ridden trees, and as others we scuttled along in the shadows of the blank-sided metal slabs the size of starships. At least twice we passed through more stasis chambers, as full of dormant horrors as the one we'd first encountered. But looking back, I found my recollections hazy, as though my mind was simply refusing to accept what I was seeing. "The whole place is a miracle, is it not?" a new voice asked. I whirled, bringing up my las pistol and froze an instant away from pulling the trigger. The speaker sounded vaguely familiar, and after a moment later I caught sight of a human figure. "All praise the Omnisire, whose bounty has been revealed to the worthy, despite the worst efforts of the unbeliever." "Logash," I said, not quite sure if he'd gone balmy or not. "We thought you were dead." But he wasn't. Worse luck. The treacherous little weasel had given us the slip in the snowstorm, and come scuttling back here as fast as he could. I admit I felt like shooting him, but the sound would have woken up the silent death around us. The Holy Guardians failed to notice me, as I would expect given my unworthiness, he said. There are mysteries here far beyond my abilities to fathom, but no doubt those of greater wisdom can commune with the machine spirit of this wondrous place. Assuming we ever managed to get out of here to tell them, Gryphon chipped in sourly. We moved again, catching glimpses of a portal at the center of the chamber, where the shambling flesh-draped Necrons walked through. I began to ponder if they came off-world. As if all of my Emperor-given luck finally paid off, we found the tunnel entrance we had first emerged from. Through hours of silence we trudged back through the ice tunnels, until emerging into the light once more. The horror-stricken looks on our faces clearly surprised the troopers, until one trotted over to us, a beaming smile upon her equine-like features. Sulla, I said. Of course. Who else would it be?
Could you magnify it a little?
Castine asked. Quintus flushed, and complied, revealing another almost imperceptible Ackerberry stain. A murmur of voices rippled around the table, and Ernolf at least had the grace to look surprised.
We missed that,
he admitted grudgingly.
Quite understandably.
Castine assured him diplomatically.
But can you tell us what it is?
I can guess.
The Magos again admitted reluctantly. I suppose for all his bluster he was a fair-minded man, but it may just have pained him to swallow his pride like that. His colleagues looked positively dyspeptic, and Pryke was gazing at him in open-mouthed astonishment. Castine just nodded coolly.
Thank you, Magos. I'm glad to see we all seem to be on the same side at last. Quintus?
For some reason the young Scivener became flustered all over again, as she looked in his direction, and stuttered for a moment before resuming.
Well, it's outside of my realm of expertise, as the Magos pointed out. But it seems logical to assume that the flare of warp energy somehow activated the dormant portal in the tomb.
Ernolf was nodding in agreement.
That would be my interpretation.
Of course. Logash butted in with the single-minded enthusiasm of the obsessive. That's how the Ambles got down there. They came through the portal and dug their way out of the tomb. That explains the anomalous habitat. He trailed off, suddenly conscious of how very much nobody else in the meeting cared. Brocklaw nodded.
So they sent a scouting party through. That makes sense.
Could be anywhere in the galaxy. Somewhere with Ambles, by the look of it. But that doesn't narrow it down much.
That's not really the question at the moment,
Castine said, dragging everyone back to point.
There's only one thing we can do. Evacuate the planet while we still have enough time to get clear.
Evacuate?
Castine echoed, clearly stunned. I nodded, conscious I was risking my whole fraudulent reputation, but that it was precisely the reputation for heroism which might just do the trick now. I adopted an expression of barely contained frustration.
I know how you feel. I've never run from a fight yet.
Which was not entirely true, of course, but no one needed to know that.
And it goes against the grain to start now. But there are wider issues at stake here. The Necrons in that tomb outnumber us by hundreds to one. And that's assuming we could disengage from the Orcs cleanly enough to take them on in a stand-up fight.
They'd still know they'd been in a scrap,
Castine said grimly. I nodded again.
I don't doubt the fighting spirit of anyone in the regiment. But if we stand and fight now, we all die. That's a plain, simple fact. They'll overrun us in a matter of hours.
More like minutes, if the ones I had seen before were anything to go by. But if I told her that, she'd never believe me.
And that's just the start.
The portal,
Castine said, the coin dropping. I nodded again.
Hundreds of thousands of them will be let loose on the galaxy. We simply can't allow that to happen.
I paused for a moment, letting the implication sink in.
We have to call in the Navy to sterilize the whole site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
You can't do that,
Ernolf shouted.
I can, and will. This facility is under martial law, which means the Commissariat is the final arbiter of what can or cannot be done.
Have you any idea of the economic value of this installation?
Ernolf asked, recovering.
None at all. I care even less. So far as I'm concerned, it's not worth the life of one soldier.
The soldier I had in mind being me, of course.
But the archaeotech, think of the knowledge, the spiritual advancement of mankind that you'd be sacrificing.
All we'd be sacrificing if we left that tomb intact as our lives. Not to mention the millions of others who'd be slaughtered if the Necrons down there revive and escape.
But they're in stasis.
The Magos persisted.
While they're dormant, we can safely examine.
We don't know that.
Castine cut in.
For all we know, they're up and about by now. And even if they aren't, their friends could be flocking through the portal from somewhere else. We simply can't risk sending anyone back down there. And that's final.
On the contrary, I don't think you can risk not sending anyone back.
Explain.
Castine said, although in a sudden agony of panic, I realized what the Magos was driving at. The worst of it was that he was right, damn it. A spasming of my bowels told me who by far was the most likely candidate to get stuck with the job.
You said it yourself.
He said triumphantly.
The portal's still active. Even if you called in your naval strike, it would be left intact and functioning for months before a flotilla could get here. Possibly even years. The Necrons would be long gone.
Emperor's bowels. He's right.
Brocklaw looked more shaken than I'd ever seen him.
We have to blow the portal before we pull out.
I felt every pair of eyes at the table look on me like the targeting auspex of a Hydra battery. The air grew tense with expectation, while my mind whirled frantically, trying to find some plausible reason why this was a truly terrible idea. But inspiration had, for once, deserted me. At length, I nodded, my mouth dry.
I can't see any alternative.
Neither can I.
Castine turned to me, solemnly pronouncing what I truly believed to be my death sentence.
Can you lead a team back down to the tomb, Commissar?
Of course I couldn't refuse, could I? Not in front of all of those people. I'd been nearly impaled on my own rhetoric, and pulling out at this stage would have ruined the reputation I didn't deserve. The 597th had been holding well above ground, but with that gargant arriving soon, and the likely awakening tomb beneath us, somehow we convinced the Mechanicus elements to evacuate. I had to keep my trembling hands in my pockets, lest Castine and Brocklaw see them. I tried a few times to subtly test if there was an alternative, but seemingly the orcs had caught wind of the Xenos tinnies, and some were peeling off for a proper fight. Detections of portal use told us that the Necrons fighting were coming from another tomb rather than the one below us, and that meant there was still time to send down the hero of the Imperium to seal it during the evacuation. I'm not going to lie to you, I said. Our chances of coming back from this assignment are practically non-existent, but it is also no exaggeration to say that the lives of everyone on this planet, not to mention the uncountable others, hang on whether we succeed or not. I flickered my eyes along the impassive faces in front of me. Not one of them blinked. I think you're the best team for the job, which is why I asked for you. But I'll only take willing volunteers. If anyone wants to pull out, you have my word. There won't be any disciplinary action taken, or a word about it on any of your records. Because, I thought, I'd be too busy being dead to worry about it. Sergeant Waylard and his squad stood in perfect parade. I had purposely chosen the regiment's longest-serving veterans, a crack team who I knew had the best chance of not turning tail as soon as death stared them in the face. Any questions? I asked. No answers came. So I drew myself up, straightened my cap, and tried to sound more confident. Good, then let's go. We descended back down the facility when our point spotted movement. Jurgen? I called out. What the frack are you doing here? My aide stepped fully into view, and the stormtroopers emerged from the cover they'd taken, looking mildly sheepish. I thought you were stowing our kit on the shuttle, I said. All taken care of, sir. He produced a thermal flask. I thought you might like a bit of tea for later, and a sandwich. He burrowed in one of his pockets for a moment. It's in there somewhere. I see, I said, silencing the barely audible snickering from a couple of the stormtroopers behind me with a quick glance before turning back to Jurgen again. And the melter? He shrugged, the heavy weapon slung across his back, shifting as his shoulders moved. I couldn't let you carry your own provisions, sir. Wouldn't be fitting. Quite, I said, astonished yet again at the depth of his loyalty. For the first time, I began to feel that I actually might get out of this ludicrous expedition in one piece after all. I suppose you better come with us then, I said. Very good, sir. He saluted as smartly as he ever did, which wasn't very, to be honest. but more than made up for that in enthusiasm, and fell into step beside me. I motioned Waylard and his men to the front, and we set off into the darkness. One thing I have to say for Waylard and his stormtroopers: they were as fast and as stealthy as I could have wished for. Jurgen and I had to work hard to keep up with them, just as we climbed down the pit that I had tumbled down before. A Gauss flare streaked from the dark and eviscerated our point man. "Place your shots," Waylard said calmly, and the surviving stormtroopers unleashed a hail of hellgun fire against our attackers. The glare of lasbolts impacting on the leading Necron dazzled my eyes. Then his chest gave away, seared and blasted by the precision volley, and it tumbled to the ice-slick floor, revealing a fresh target behind it, already leveling another Gauss flare. Metallic bodies slumped to the ice, but more were coming. I called Jurgen to the front. He sent a volley of superheated plasma that briefly fully lit the tunnel. The rest of the Necrons melted away. I couldn't help contrasting the reaction of Gryphon's team to the loss of Lunt with the Stormtroopers' matter-of-fact dismissal of the loss of one of their own, and mentioned as much to the sergeant. Unfortunately, the fact that first contact was up here was a bad sign. We pushed further until we made contact again, but this time it wasn't an enemy. "Logash?" I said. The young Tep priest must have recognized my voice, because he turned and looked up, though his metal eyes made any expression hard to read. A sense of recognition began to surface, through the expression of stark terror flushing his face. "Commissar Cain." His voice trembled, wavering in pitch like a boy in early adolescence. If he wasn't bonkers before, I thought, he certainly was now. "You were right. We were unworthy to tread parts on the sacred mysteries of the Omnissiah," he muttered incoherently. To the surprise of no one, Logash had given back his findings to Magos Ernolf in secret, defying the evacuation orders in the name of the sacred tech. Seemingly, the Mechanicus had sent their own expedition immediately, and discovered just how welcoming the Necrons were to visitors who wanted to pray and throw oils at their work. I saw the mangled remains of that expedition around us. I dragged Logash up, as a sound grew before us. I peered into the dark, seeing what I thought to be Magos Ernolf. Then the shambling horror stalked forward, the evident skin and biometrics draped over itself. The skin flares were here. "Frack this!" I shouted. "Jurgen!" On cue, my aide unleashed another blast from his melter into the center of the group, cutting a swath through them as efficiently as before. Once again, the Necrons caught by full force of the blast were simply annihilated, flashing into vapor as thoroughly as victims of their own terrible weapons. We lost only one this time, and once again, but more unnerving, Sergeant Waylard and his squad showed no emotion. "How far to the objective?" Waylard asked. "About 300 meters, I said, using all my strength to keep my sanity. We picked up the mewing Logash and pushed on, until again the sickly green glow grew, and the walls became black and angular. We saw the portal. It pulsed like the beating of a diseased heart. I forced down the surge of dread which suddenly suffused me. The glow intensified for a moment, with an accompanying thunder crack of displaced air, which rumbled and echoed through that city-sized cavern. It was definitely active. "Move," one of the troopers cut in, as blandly unemotional as before. 11 o'clock, 30 meters. We turned to face this new threat. The quartet of stormtroopers raised their hellguns, whilst Jurgen lifted the melter into a firing position. I noticed Logash was trembling violently. "Omnissiah, protect thy circuits," he mumbled. I heard the rattle of Waylard and then his men, mutterings of the God Emperor spilling desperately. I turned to see the approaching Necrons that seemed more humanoid than their skeleton counterparts. It was then that the primal dread, one so complete and horrifying, gripped me. We started firing wildly. I fought against that rush of primal emotion, feeling my very sense of self under threat in a way I hadn't experienced since the Slaneshi witch had tried to sacrifice my soul to her perverted deity on Skollenberg over a decade before. My shooting was entirely by instinct now. The green lances of Gauss flare beam missed me by a couple of centimeters and punched a neat hole through the smooth-sided cabinet beside me. I kept shooting back, taking my assailant in the chest and making a stagger for but a moment before resuming his unhurried advance. Waylard and his men scattered, as the more sentient Necrons began to hunt. I saw one trooper's head cleanly chopped off in a fluid motion. It was only when Jurgen came next to me that the dread ceased, like a door shutting. We grabbed Logash and ran for cover, throwing ourselves underneath enormous cabling. Only shadow and eerie green glow was left to be seen. We heard the screams of mortal men finally cease, and waited to see if death was around the corner. To my relief, however, the Necrons seemed to be mildly disorientated every time they approached our hiding place, veering off just before they had come within a handful of meters of us, a deliverance I could only attribute to Jurgen's particular qualities. At length, when everything seemed to go quiet again, I decided it was time to move. The evacuation must be well underway by now, and I meant to be on a shuttle and safe aboard the Pure of Heart before anything had a chance to go wrong. What about the portal, sir? Jurgen wondered aloud. I shrugged. Nothing we can do about it now. Which was actually true, as the stormtroopers had been carrying the melter charges, which were the only things that might have stood some chance in destroying the portal, and they had been vaporized along with the soldiers. We made for the surface, hoping the evacuation would be done by the time the nightmare rose from the tunnels. Fizzling streams of green energy finally caught up to us, as I, Jurgen, and unfortunately, Logash scrambled back through the ice tunnels, Jurgen periodically sending back blasts of melter towards the ever-closing horde of skeletons. We were about to be overrun, when Jurgen grabbed me and pulled me within a crevasse, off to the side. We sat in the dark and silence, as we heard the metallic tread grow and then leave. "Praise the Omnissiah for our deliverance," Logash began, and I hushed him quickly. Any idea where this goes? It wasn't on the chart I'd seen before, but that was hardly surprising, showing as it did every sign of being a natural fault rather than being dug. Logash pondered a moment. "It seems to be bearing towards the main processing area," he said at last. We crawled for an hour in the freezing cold tunnel until Logash stopped. "Dead end," he said. I could have throttled him, but unfortunately Jurgen was in the way. I shook my head, unwilling to believe it. It can't be. The words were a reflex denial, but as I said them I was sure that I was right. All of my tunneler rat instincts told me so. I wondered for a moment why I was so sure. Then I realized I could feel a faint current of air on my face. "There's a draft here." "What the hell's that?" I asked. Logash thumped with his hand, producing the unmistakable dull thud of thick metal. "One of the main evacuation pipes," he said. "Runs up to the processing plant on the surface." "And what's in it at the moment?" I asked. An idea so audacious struck me. "Nothing now. The plant's shutting down." His voice trailed off, as he evidently came to the same conclusion I had. I reached out an arm towards him, past my aide. "Can you get behind Jurgen?" I asked. "I can try," he replied gleefully. A blast of Jurgen's melter got us in. Finding handholds for repair works, we started to climb. After a while I became aware of a faint serration in my ear, and realized that my combeat had come within range of the regimental voxnet. We were closer to the surface than I'd realized, and a flood of relief almost knocked the breath from my lungs. If someone was still here, I wasn't too late to get on a shuttle out. My vox restored, and I immediately ordered barricades to the deepest levels of the facility. It might not do much, but it was better than slaughter. I had no doubt by now the whole tomb was close to awakening. Jurgen, I, and Logash punched out into the main facility. It was then that Logash gave me the best news of the day. We were close to the command shrine of the facility, and thus the opportunity for me to be even further from death was a welcome one. We approached the shrine door. "I'm not sure I should open it," the tech priest said, eyeing Jurgen and myself with a speculative expression on his face. "This is a holy place. Only ordained and sanctified personnel are permitted beyond this point." "Fine," I said. "We're on a mission for the Emperor. Can't get much holier than that, right?" Logash looked confused. "That would be an ecumenical matter," he said. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to judge." "Don't worry. I am," I said. "Now are you going to open the fracking door, or will Brother Jurgen do it?" My aide stepped forward, raising the melter, and Logash hit the activation rune with almost indecent haste. Try not to touch anything, Logash warned, brushing past Jurgen, who was already making the sign of the Aquila, his jaw even slacker than usual. Can you see the whole mine from here? I asked. He nodded. The display came alive before me, and the picture I started to build up was grim, to say the least. It didn't take me long to establish that the lower levels were crawling with Necrons, hundreds at least, and that they were systematically combing the tunnels, moving ever higher as they went. I voxed Castine. By my estimate, we've got about half an hour before they reach the surface, if we're lucky, I said. The landing pads above were still swarmed with civilians, the 597th also still engaged at the perimeters as the Orcs were now fully upon them. We needed to delay the Necrons. It was then that an idea came to me, one that made me almost giddy with excitement as I darted over to Logash. How much is in the tanks at the moment? I asked. Roughly 8 million liters, he said. Since the tankers can't land with the Orcs, it's built up rather, but still within acceptable safety parameters, I assure you. I was rather hoping it was unsafe, I said. And if he had any eyebrows, I'm sure he would have raised them at that point. I pointed to the tangle of pipework around the storage tanks. Do any of those pipes connect directly to the mine? I asked. Not directly, no. He looked at me quizzically. Why do you ask? Because if we could dump all that liquid down the shaft, it should really give the Necrons something to worry about, I said. A slow smile began to spread across the tech priest's face. Excellent, I said, feeling a flare of optimism returning at last. Excitement was in the stale air, as I and Jurgen watched Logash's fingers dance across the controls. Logash was near giggling as he unleashed the liquid promethium of the entire facility out. I watched on the feed as Necrons were swept away in a gushing tide, the green lenses swallowed by the dark liquid that rushed down towards their foul tomb. It would take time for the promethium to reach the portal, but it would create a rather big headache that would definitely give the Imperial Navy enough time to seal them. We rushed to the surface landing pad, Castine and Brocklaw grinning at me. Well done, Commissar. Brocklaw shook my hand firmly. I don't think anyone else could have come close to achieving what you did today. Well, the next time we run across a Necron tomb, you're welcome to try, I told him. Snow and rubble was falling around us, as Valhallans and civilians crowded for the next transport. What's the situation with the Orcs? I asked Brocklaw, but before he could respond, a titanic explosion detonated amongst the refinery buildings, reducing the main administratum block to rubble in an instant. Debris pattered down around us, mixed with chunks of ice and what looked uncomfortably like fragments of human tissue. The shadow grew, and it was then that I noticed the Gargant had arrived. An ear-splitting amplified vox screamed "Wah!" My ears rang as the towering mass of cobbled-together buildings and tanks loomed above us. The 597th turned as Castine screamed to open fire. I drew my chainsword in a futile need to fight the towering death. The Gargant lurched forward again, and impelled by panic or instinct, I finally noticed a deep gash in his leg. It was a slim chance, but... Target his left leg, I yelled, and the Chimera tank crews switched their aim, pouring a concentrated barrage of heavy bolter rounds against the single, vulnerable spot. For a moment I thought the desperate gamble would fail, but as the torrent of fire chewed away at the torn and overstressed metal, the towering Leviathan began to sway alarmingly. The damaged limb seemed to seize up entirely, then failed altogether with a crack of rending metal. Abruptly it lost equilibrium, toppling absurdly slowly at first, then faster and faster, as more of that titanic bulk neared the ground. The Orcs around it scattered in panic, like ants beneath a descending boot, and a gratifying number of them failed to make it. Finish them off, Castine ordered, and the Valhallans responded with a will, surging forward to engage the stunned survivors. After a short exchange of weapon fire, it was all over, the few remaining Orcs fleeing beyond the effective range of our lasguns. Relief like nothing I'd ever felt before flooded my veins, as the last transport lifted from Sema or Kelsey. I saw a glittering tide of moving metal emerging from the mouth of the mine, more warriors than I could count, blurring into a single amorphous entity, which flowed between the buildings like floodwater toward the Orcs. Then the ground cracked beneath them. The whole valley erupted in a boom, as the Prometheum was ignited. A shockwave jutted the ship as a bloom of fire covered the valley and reached the upper atmosphere. I, Castine, Brooklaw, Jurgen, and Zella stared down from the command room, looking at the destruction we had wrought. Sima Orichalci was now a problem for the Inquisition, and I knew just who to contact. The first thing Amberly did when my message finally caught up with her was to place the whole system under inquisitorial quarantine. If there was one bright spot in this whole affair, it was that I got to spend a little free time with her. After the interminable debriefing sessions were finally over, and she finished going around every trooper in the regiment who had seen or heard anything of what we'd found on that miserable ice ball and threatened them with the wrath of the Emperor, I assured none would ever breathe a word of it again. On the last night I met her in her private accommodation. By the pile of data slates I could see she was stressed. I wandered across and massaged some of the tension from her shoulders. As the servitors set out dishes and cutlery on the dining table, she smiled as the covers came off. Hackenberry sorbet, one of my favourites. That hadn't been hard to remember, so I smiled in return. You did say you would live off the stuff if you could the last time you ordered it. So I did, she said. The smile widened as the main course came into view. What's that? She asked. Amble steak, I said. I think they owe me that much.